Tragedy at Ravensthorpe by JJ Connington. Part 2. As soon as the light went out, I pulled on a thick pair of gloves and got a bit of lead pipe out of my slapstick. But there was a bit of a scuffle in the dark round the showcase, and someone must have put their elbow through the glass. I heard it go crash in the dark. I shoved along till I was opposite the medallion section of the case. Luckily someone made way for me just then, and I got to work with my lead pipe. The glass smashed easily. It must have been cracked before. So I put my hand in and groped about. I could find only 3 medallions instead of 6, but I hooked them out, slabbed on some plasticine, stuck them under the case for future reference, and cut my stick for the door. Someone was ahead of me there, and I heard some sort of mix-up in the dark. Then I wandered out into the garden by the east door, as soon as I could find it in the dark. And I've been out there having a smoke till now. When I came in again, I heard you'd been asking for me, so I came along. Sir Clinton considered for a moment. I want to be quite clear on one point, he said with no relaxation of his manner. You say that you heard the glass crack before you began your work. Are you certain of that? Quite, said Foxy. And when you got your hand into the case you could find only 3 medallions. That was all. I was groping for the top row of the 6, and naturally it surprised me when I felt only 3 altogether. I'm quite certain about it. So you were evidently the second thief at the case tonight. Sir Clinton concluded. Foxy flushed at the word thief, but a glance at the face of the chief constable evidently persuaded him that it would be best not to argue on philology at that moment. He contented himself with nodding sullenly in response to Sir Clinton's remark. Joan relieved the tension. Anyhow, we've got the medallions safe, and that's all that really matters, she pointed out. Let's have a look at them, Cecil. She took them from his hand and scrutinized them carefully. Yes, these are the real Leonardos, she affirmed, without hesitation. That's all right. Quite all right, admitted Sir Clinton, with a wry smile, except for one point. Why were the replicas stolen and the real things left untouched? That certainly seems to need explaining, Una admitted. Can you throw any light on it, Foxy? You're the only one of us who was near the case. There was no hint of accusation in her tone, but Foxy seemed to read an insinuation into her remark. I haven't got the replicas, if that's what you mean, Una, he protested angrily. I just took what was left, and it turns out to be the real things. Whoever was ahead of me took the duds. Cecil considered the point, and then appealed to Sir Clinton. Doesn't that seem to show that an outsider's been at work, someone who knew a certain amount about the collection, but not quite enough? An outsider wouldn't know we had the replicas in the case alongside the real things. He just grabbed 3 medallions and think he got away with it. Sir Clinton shook his head. Your hypothetical outsider, Cecil, must have had a preliminary look at the case before the lights went out, just to make sure of getting to the right spot in the dark. Therefore he must have seen the 6 medallions there, and he'd have taken the lot instead of only 3, when he had his chance. That upsets your apple cart, Cecil, said Joan. It's obvious Sir Clinton's right. Unless, a fresh idea seemed to strike her, unless the thief knew of the replicas and had wrong information, so that he imagined he was taking the Leonardos when he really was grabbing the replicas. I mean, he may have thought that the replicas were in the top row instead of the lower one. She glanced at Sir Clinton's face to see what he thought of her suggestion, but he betrayed nothing. Wouldn't you have taken the whole 6, Joan, if you had been in his shoes? Joan had to admit that she would have made certain by snatching the complete set. There's more in it than that, was all that Sir Clinton could be induced to say. Before any more could be said, the door opened again. This time it was Michael Clifton who entered the museum. You've got him, Michael, cried Joan. Who was he? Michael shook his head. He got away from us. It's a damned mysterious business how he managed it, but he slipped through our fingers, Joan. Well, tell us what happened, quick. Joan ordered. I didn't think you'd botch it, Michael. Michael obeyed her at once and launched into an account of the moonlight chase of the fugitive. Sir Clinton listened attentively, but interposed no questions until Michael had finished his story. Let's have this quite clear, the chief constable said, when the tale had been completed. You had him hemmed in at the cliff top. You heard a splash, but there was no sign of anyone swimming in the lake. You discovered a rope tied to the balustrade and lying down the cliff face to the cave mouth. He wasn't in the cave when you looked for him there. Is that correct? That's how it happened. You're sure he didn't break back through your cordon? Certain. And you found Maurice in one of the fairy houses in the spinney? Yes. He seemed in a queer state. Sir Clinton, glancing at Cecil's face, was surprised to see on it the same expression of almost malicious glee which he had surprised on the day when they examined that very fairy house during their walk. Quite obviously Cecil knew something more than the chief constable did. "Does that suggest anything to you, Cecil?" he demanded point blank. At the query, Cecil's face came back to normal suddenly. "To me? No, why should it?" "I merely wondered," said Sir Clinton, without seeming to notice anything. It was clear that whatever Cecil knew, it was something which he was not prepared to tell. Foxy had listened intently to Michael's narrative, and as the chief constable seemed to have come to the end of his interrogations, Foxy put a question of his own. "You say Maurice was wearing a white Pierrot costume? So was the fellow you were chasing. So was the man next me at the case when the lights went out. I suppose you're suggesting that Maurice is at the bottom of the business, Foxy," Michael replied at once. "I'll swallow that if you'll answer one question. Why should a man burgle his own house?" "Lord alone knows," Foxy admitted humbly. "I've no brainwave on the subject." "It seems rather improbable," observed Sir Clinton. "I think you'll have to produce a motive before that idea could be accepted." He glanced round at the door as he spoke and added, "Here's Maurice himself." Maurice Chasewater had entered the room while the chief constable was speaking. He had discarded his fancy costume and wore ordinary evening dress, against the black of which his face looked white and drawn. He came up to the group and leaned on the showcase as if for support. "So you've muddled it, Michael," he commented, after a pause. "You didn't get your hands on the fellow, after all." Dismissing Michael with almost open contempt, he turned to Sir Clinton. "What's the damage? Did the fellow get away with anything of value?" "Nothing much, only your 3 replicas of the Leonardo medallions, so far as we can see." As he spoke, his glance telegraphed a warning to the rest of the group. It seemed unnecessary that Maurice should know all the ins and outs of the night's doings. But Foxy evidently failed to grasp the meaning of the chief constable's look. "We saved the real medallions for you, Maurice. Vote of thanks to us, eh? How did you manage that?" Maurice demanded, with no sign of gratitude in his voice. Quite oblivious of the warning looks thrown at him by the rest of the group, Foxy launched at once into a detailed account of the whole practical joke and its sequel. Maurice listened frowningly to the story. When it was completed, he made no direct comment. "Who's got the medallions?" "You, Joan? I'll take them." When she had handed them over, he scrutinized them carefully. "These seem to be the Leonardo ones," he confirmed. Sir Clinton interposed a question. "Were the medallions and the replicas in their usual places tonight, Maurice? I mean, were the real things in the top row and the electros down below?" Maurice gave a curt nod of assent. He weighed the 3 medallions unconsciously in his hand for a moment, then moved over to the safe in the wall of the museum. "These things will be safer under lock and key, now," he said. He opened the safe, inserted the medallions, closed the safe door with a clang, and busied himself with the combination of the lock. Before saying anything further, Sir Clinton waited until Maurice had returned to the group. "There's one thing," he said. "I shall have to look into this affair officially now. It's essential that things shall be left as they are. Especially the place where that fellow gave you the slip, Clifton. Nobody must be wandering about there, up at the spinney, until I've done with the ground. There may be clues left, for all one can tell, and we can't run the risk of their being destroyed." Maurice looked up gloomily. "Very well. I'll give orders to the keepers to patrol the wood and turn everyone back. That do. So long as no one sets foot on anything beyond the wood, I'll be quite satisfied. But it's important, Maurice. Impress that on your keepers, please." Maurice indicated his comprehension with a nod. "I'll begin dragging the lakelet up there tomorrow morning," Sir Clinton added. "Something must have gone into the water to make the splash that was heard, and perhaps we shall find it. I don't mind anyone going down by the lakeside. It's the top of the cliff that I want kept intact." He looked at his watch. "You're on the phone here? I must ring up the police in Hincheldene now and make arrangements for tomorrow. Show me your phone, please, Joan. And as I must get some sleep tonight, I'll say goodbye to the rest of you now. Come along, Ariel. Lead the way." Chapter 7. What was in the lake? "I was afraid of it," Sir Clinton observed, as he lifted the dripping pole with which he had been sounding the water of the lakelet. The net will be no good, Inspector. With these spikes of rock jutting up from the bottom all over the place, you couldn't get a clean sweep. And if there's anything here at all, it's pretty sure to have lodged in one of the cavities between the spikes. It was the morning after the masked ball at Ravensthorpe. The chief constable had made all his arrangements overnight, so that when he reached the shore of the artificial lake, everything was in readiness. The decrepit raft had been strengthened, a large net had been brought for the purpose of dragging the pool, and several grapnels had been procured, in case the net turned out to be useless. Sir Clinton had gone out on the raft to sound the water and discover whether the net could be utilized, but the results had not been encouraging. Inspector Armadale listened to the verdict with a rather gloomy face. "It's a pity," he commented regretfully. "Dragging with the grapnel is a kind of hit-or-miss job, Sir Clinton, and it'll take far longer than working with a net." Sir Clinton acquiesced with a gesture. "We'd better start close in under the cliff face," he said. "If anything came down from the top, it can't have gone far before it sank. One of the people last night was watching the pool and he saw nothing on the surface after the splash, so it ought to be somewhere near the cave mouth. You can pole over to the shore now, Constable. We've done with this part of the business." The constable obeyed the order, and soon Sir Clinton rejoined the inspector on the bank. "It's likely to be a troublesome business," the chief constable admitted as his subordinate came up. "The bottom's very irregular, and the chances are that the grapnel will stick 2 times out of 3. However, the sooner we get to work, the better." He considered for a moment or two. "Tack a light line to the grapnel as well as the rope. Get the raft out past the cave and let a constable pitch the grapnel in there. Then when you've dragged, or if the grapnel sticks, he can pull the hook back again with the light line and start afresh alongside the place where he made the last cast. But it's likely to be a slow business, as you say." The inspector agreed and set his constables to work at once. Sir Clinton withdrew to a little distance, sat down on a small hillock from which he could oversee the dragging operations, and patiently awaited the start of the search. His eyes, wandering with apparent incuriosity over the group at the water's edge, noted with approval that Armadale was wasting no time. Having made his instructions clear, the inspector came over to where the chief constable was posted. "Sit down, Inspector," Sir Clinton invited. "This may take all day, you know, and it's as cheap sitting as standing." When the inspector had seated himself, the chief constable turned to him with a question. "You've seen to it that no one has gone up onto the terrace?" Inspector Armadale nodded affirmatively. "No one's been up on top," he explained. "I'd like to go and have a look round myself, but since you were so clear about it, I haven't gone." "Don't go," Sir Clinton reiterated his order. "I've a sound reason for letting no one up there." He glanced for a moment at the group of constables. "Another thing, Inspector," he continued. "There's no secrecy about that matter. In fact, it might be useful if you'd let it leak out to the public that no one has been up above there and that no one will be allowed to go until I give the word. Spread it round, you understand." Slightly mystified, apparently, the inspector acquiesced. "Do you see your way through the case, Sir Clinton?" he demanded. "You've given me the facts, but we'll need a good deal more, it seems to me." Sir Clinton pulled out his cigarette case and thoughtfully began to smoke before answering the question. When he spoke again, his reply was an indirect one. "There's an old jurist saying that I always keep in mind," he said. "It helps to clarify one's ideas in a case. Quis, quid, ubi, quibus auxilius, cur, quomodo, quando? That puts our whole business into a nutshell." He glanced at the inspector's face. "Your Latin's as feeble as my own, perhaps? There's an English equivalent. What was the crime? Who did it? When was it done? And where? How done? And with what motive? Who in the deed did share? How many of these questions can you answer now, offhand, Inspector? The rest of them will tell you what you've still got to ferret out." Inspector Armadale pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Would you mind repeating it, Sir Clinton? I'd see through it better if I had it down in black and white." The chief constable repeated the doggerel and Armadale jotted it down under his dictation. "That seems fairly searching," he admitted, rereading it as he spoke. "Quite enough for present purposes. Now, Inspector, how much do you really know? I mean, how many answers can you give? There are only 7 questions in all. Take them one by one and let's hear your answers." "It's a pretty stiff catechism," said the inspector, looking again at his notebook. "I'll have a try, though, if you give me time to think over it." Sir Clinton smiled at the qualification. Think it over, then, Inspector, he said. I'll just go and set them to work with the dragging. They seem to be ready to make a start. He rose and walked down to the group at the edge of the pool. You know what's wanted? He asked. Well, suppose we make a start. Get the raft out to about 10 yards or so beyond the cave mouth and begin by flinging the grapnel in as near the cliff edge as you can. Then work gradually outwards. If it sticks, try again very slightly off the line of the last cast. He watched 1 or 2 attempts which gave no result and then turned back to the hillock again. Well, Inspector, he demanded as he sat down and turned his eyes on the group engaged with the dragging operations. What do you make of it? Inspector Armadale looked up from his notebook. That's a sound little rhyme, he admitted. It lets you see what you don't know and what you do know. Sir Clinton suppressed a smile successfully. Or what you think you know, perhaps, Inspector. Well, if you like to put it that way, sir. But some things I think one can be sure of. Sir Clinton's face showed nothing of his views on this question. Let's begin at the beginning, he suggested. What was the crime? That's clear enough, the inspector affirmed without hesitation. These 3 electrotypes have been stolen. That's the crime. Sir Clinton seemed to be engrossed in the dragging which was going on methodically below them. You think so, he said at length. I'm not so sure. Inspector Armadale corrected himself. I meant that I'd charge the man with stealing the replicas. You couldn't charge him with anything else, since nothing else is missing. At least, that's what you told me. He wanted the real medallions, but he didn't pull that off. Sir Clinton refused to be drawn. He resorted to one of his indirect replies. What was the crime? He repeated. Now, I'll put a case to you, Inspector. Suppose that you saw 2 men in the distance and that you could make out that one of them was struggling and the second man was beating him on the head. What crime would you call that? Assault and battery. I suppose so, Armadale admitted. But suppose, further, that when you reached them, you found the victim dead of his injuries. What would you call the crime then? Murder, I suppose. So your view of the crime would depend upon the stage at which you witnessed it, eh? That's just my position in this Ravensthorpe affair. You've been looking at it from yesterday's standpoint, and you call it a theft of 3 replicas. But I wonder what you'll call it when we know the whole of the facts. The inspector declined to follow his chief to this extent. All the evidence we've got, so far, points to theft, sir. I've no fresh data that would let me put a new name to it. Then you regard it as a completed crime which has partly failed in its object. The inspector gave his acquiescence with a nod. You think it's something else, Sir Clinton? He inquired. The chief constable refused to be explicit. You've got all the evidence, Inspector. Do you really think a gang would take the trouble to steal replicas when they could just as easily have taken the 3 originals? That's the point. The replicas have no intrinsic value beyond the gold in them, and that can't be worth more than £20 or £30 at the very outside. A mediocre haul for a smart gang, isn't it? Hardly trade union wages, I should think. It seems queer at first sight, sir, he admitted, but I think I can account for that all right when you come to the rest of your rhyme. Sir Clinton showed his interest. Then let's go on, he suggested. The next question is, who did it? What's your answer to that, Inspector? To my mind, there seems to be only one possible thief. Sir Clinton pricked up his ears. You mean it was a single-handed job? Who was the man, then? Foxton Polegate, asserted the inspector. He watched Sir Clinton's face narrowly as he brought out the name, but the chief constable might have been wearing a mask for all the change there was in his features as he listened to the inspector's suggestion. As if he felt that he had overstepped the bounds of prudence, Armadale added hastily. I said possible thief, sir. I don't claim to be able to bring it home to him yet. But you think it might even be probable instead of only possible, Inspector? Let's hear the evidence, please. Inspector Armadale turned over the leaves of his notebook until he reached some entries which he had previously made. First of all, sir, Polegate must have known the value of these medallions. The originals, I mean. Second, he learned that they would be on show last night, and he knew where they'd be placed in the museum. Third, it was after Polegate came by this knowledge that the practical joke was planned. Fourth, who suggested the sham burglary? Polegate. Then fifth, who gave himself the job of actually taking the medallions? Polegate again. Sixth, Where was Polegate immediately after the robbery? We've only his own word for it that he was strolling about, having a smoke. He might have been elsewhere, easily enough. 7th, he was dressed up as a harlequin when you saw him, but he might quite easily have slipped on a white jacket and a pair of Pierrot's trousers over his harlequin costume. He could disguise himself as a Pierrot in a couple of ticks and come out as a harlequin again just as quick. So he might quite well have been the man in white that they were all busy chasing last night. 8th, he knows the ground thoroughly and could give strangers the slip easily enough at the end of the chase. And, 9th, he didn't appear when you wanted him last night. He only turned up when he'd had plenty of time to get home again, even if he'd been the man in white. That's a set of 9 points that need looking into. Prima facie, there's a case for suspicion, if there's no more. And there isn't anything like so strong a case against anyone else, Sir Clinton. Well, let's take the rest of the first line, said the Chief Constable, without offering any criticism of the inspector's statement of the case. When was it done, and where? At 11:45 p.m. and in the museum, retorted Armadale. That's beyond dispute. It's the clearest thing in the whole evidence. I should be inclined to put it at 11:44 p.m. at the latest, or perhaps 11:43 p.m., said Sir Clinton, with an air of fastidiousness. The inspector looked at him suspiciously, evidently feeling that he was being laughed at for his display of accuracy. I go by Miss Rainhill's evidence, he declared. She was the only one who had her eye on her watch, and she said she pulled out the switch at 11:45 precisely. I go by the evidence of Polegate and young Chasewater, said Sir Clinton, with a faint parody of the inspector's manner. They were taken by surprise when the light went out, although they expected it to be extinguished at 11:45 p.m. Oh, have it your own way, sir, if you lay any stress on the point, conceded the inspector. Make it 11.44 or 11.45. It's all the same, so far as I'm concerned. Armadale seemed slightly ruffled by his chief's method of approaching the subject. Sir Clinton turned to another side of the matter. I suppose you say the crime has been committed in the museum, he inquired. The inspector looked at him suspiciously. You're trying to pull my leg, sir. Of course, it was committed in the museum. Sir Clinton's tone became apologetic. I keep forgetting that we're not talking about the same thing. Perhaps. Of course, the theft of the replicas was committed in the museum. We're quite in agreement there. He threw away his cigarette, selected a fresh one, and lighted it before continuing. And on that basis, I suppose there's no mystery about the next query in the rhyme, how done? None whatever, in my mind, the inspector affirmed. Polegate could take what he wanted, once the light was out. Sir Clinton did not dispute this point. Of course, he said. And now for the next query, with what motive? Where do you stand in that matter, Inspector? But here Armadale evidently felt himself on sure ground. Polegate's a rackety young fool, sir. This is where local knowledge comes in. He's got no common sense, always playing practical jokes. He's been steadily muddling away the money his father left him. I shouldn't be surprised if he's hard up. That's the motive. And you think he'd steal from his oldest friends? Every man has his price, retorted the inspector, bluntly. Put on the screw hard enough in the way of temptation, and any man'll fall for it. Rather a hard saying that, Inspector, and perhaps a trifle too sweeping. Sir Clinton turned on Armadale suddenly. What would be your price, now, if I asked you to hush up this case against young Polegate? Put a figure on it, will you? Armadale flushed angrily at the suggestion. Then, seeing that he had been trapped, he laughed awkwardly. Nobody knows even their own price till it's put on the table, Sir Clinton, he countered, with a certain acuteness. The Chief Constable turned away from the subject. You're depending on there being a fair chance of Polegate getting away with the medallions without being suspected. But when young Chasewater and Miss Rainhill were in the scheme as well as Polegate, suspicion was sure to light on him when the medallions vanished. The other two were certain to tell what they knew about the business. Inspector Armadale glanced once more at his notebook in order to refresh his memory of the rhyme. That really comes under the final head, who in the deed did share, he pointed out. Pass along to the next caravan, then, if you wish, Sir Clinton suggested. What animals have you in the final cage? The inspector seemed to deprecate his flippancy. It's been very cleverly done, he said, seriously. You objected that suspicion was bound to fall on young Polegate, and so it would have done, if he hadn't covered his tracks so neatly. He's set everyone on the hunt for a gang at work, or at least for an outside criminal. Now I believe it was a one-man show from the start, worked from the inside. Polegate planned the practical joke, that gave him his chance. Then he forced himself forward as the fellow who was to do the actual stealing, and that let him get his hands on the medallions while young Chasewater held the keeper up for him. Without the hold-up of the keeper, the thing was a washout. The joke helped young Polegate to enlist innocent assistance. But still suspicion would attach to him, Sir Clinton objected. Yes, except for a false trail, the inspector agreed. But he laid a false trail. Instead of waiting for the switch to be pulled out, he fired his shot from the bay, extinguished the light and then rushed out of the bay and went for the medallions. Well, said Sir Clinton in an encouraging tone. When he'd smashed the glass of the case, he took out the whole 6 medallions, and not merely 3 of them as he told you he'd done. And then he pocketed the replicas and stuck the real things under the case with plasticine. Then he continued the false trail by bolting out of the house. He was the man in white. When he got clear of the people who were chasing him, he came back to the house again, ready to play his part as an innocent practical joker. And he had his tale ready, of how someone was beside him at the case, wearing a Pierrot costume. That stamped the notion of an outside gang on everybody's mind. Both sets of medallions had gone. He, the innocent practical joker, could have produced the replicas from his pocket and sworn they were all that the gang had left in the case by the time he got to it. And then, a few days later, he'd have managed to get into the museum on some excuse, he's a friend of the family, and he'd have had no difficulty in taking the real medallions from under the case where he'd left them. He'd have to take the chance that they'd been overlooked. The false trail would help in that. He'd hardly expect a close search of the museum after the man in white had got clear away. And by running the business on these lines, he'd avoid any chance of being caught with the stuff actually in his pocket at any time. But in that case, why did he hand over the real things to me like a lamb as soon as I challenged him? The inspector was ready for this. Because as soon as he came into the museum last night, he found that you apparently knew everything, or a good deal more than he'd counted on. Anyhow, he didn't know how much you knew, and he felt he'd got into a tight corner. He just let the whole thing slide and made up his mind to get out before things got too hot. So he pretended that so far as he was concerned, the practical joke was the thing, and he gave up the real medallions and kept the replicas in his pocket. Why? He might as well have given up the lot. No, the inspector contradicted. He'd got to keep the false trail going, for otherwise there would have been awkward questions as to why he diverged from the prearranged program. I mean the shooting out of the light, the lies about the man in white, and so forth. So he stuck to the replicas and made out that there was an outsider mixed up in the affair. But thanks to the practical joke, the outsider had missed the real stuff, and Polegate was really the savior of the Leonardo set. Sir Clinton seemed to be pondering over Armadale's version of the affair. At last he gave his own view. A jury wouldn't look at that evidence, he pointed out. I don't suppose they would, Armadale admitted. But there may be more to come yet. I expect so, Sir Clinton agreed. He rose as he spoke, and, followed by the inspector, went down to the edge of the lakelet. No luck yet? He inquired. None, sir. It's a very difficult bottom to work a grapnel over. It sticks 3 times out of 4. Sir Clinton watched the line of the drag which they were making. It'll take a while to cover the ground at this rate, he commented, noting the smallness of the area they had searched up to that moment. As he turned away from the waterside, he noticed Cecil Chasewater approaching round the edge of the lakelet, and leaving the inspector to superintend the dragging, he walked over to meet the newcomer. As he came near, he could see that Cecil's face was sullen and downcast. Morning, Sir Clinton. I heard you were here, so I came across to say goodbye before I clear out. Sir Clinton could hardly pretend astonishment in view of what he knew about the state of affairs at Ravensthorpe, but he did not conceal his regret at the news. There was a row royal between Maurice and me this morning, Cecil explained, gloomily. Of course this medallion business gave him his chance, and he jumped in with both feet, you know. He abused me like a fishwife and finally gave me permission to do anything except stay at Ravensthorpe after tonight. So I'm off. I wish you hadn't got mixed up with that silly practical joke, Sir Clinton said in some concern. I can't forgive that young blighter for luring you into it. Cecil's resentment against his brother was evidently too deep to let him look on the matter from this point of view. If it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. Any excuse would have served his turn, you know. He'd have flung me out sooner or later, probably sooner. I felt for long enough that he was itching to clear me off the premises. Fox's little show only precipitated things. The root of the trouble was there long before. Well, it's a sad business. Sir Clinton saw that it was useless to dwell on the subject. You're going up to town? Any address you can give me? I'll probably put up with a man for a day or two. He's been inviting me to his place once or twice lately, but I've never been able to fit it in, so I may as well take him at his word now. I've got to look round for something to do, you know. If you want someone to speak for you, Cecil, refer them to me when you apply for anything. And, by the way, if you happen to run short, you know my address. A letter will always find me. Cecil thanked him rather awkwardly. I hope it won't come to that, he wound up. Something may turn up sooner than one hopes. Sir Clinton thought it well to change the subject again. By the way, Cecil, he asked, do you know anything about this man Foss? What sort of person is he? It seemed an unfortunate topic. Cecil's manner was anything but gracious as he replied. Foss? Oh, you know what sort of a fellow he is already. A damned eavesdropper on his hosts and a beggar with a tongue hinged in the middle so that he can talk with both ends at once. I'd like to wring his neck for him. What do they call the breed that runs off and splits to the police? Coppers narks, isn't it? It wasn't exactly that side of him that I wanted to hear about, Cecil. I'm quite fully acquainted with his informative temperament already. What I want to know is the sort of man he is socially and so forth. Cecil curbed his vexation with an effort. Oh, he seems to have decent enough manners, a bit Yankee, perhaps, in some things. He must do well enough out of this agent business of his, acting for Keswick and the like, you know. He arrived here with a big car, a chauffeur, and a man. Except for his infernal tale-bearing, I can't say he's anything out of the ordinary. Sir Clinton, apparently feeling that he had struck the wrong vein in the conversational strata, contented himself with a nod of comprehension and let Cecil choose his own subject for the next stage in their talk. He was somewhat surprised when it came. Have you heard the latest from the village? Cecil demanded. Sir Clinton shook his head. I've had very little time to collect local gossip this morning, Cecil. I've been busy getting things started for this bit of work in the lake, you see. If you'd been down in Hincheldene village you could hardly have missed it. I went down this morning to get some tobacco and I found the whole place buzzing with it. That was before I'd seen Maurice, luckily. Suppose you tell me what it is, Sir Clinton suggested, dryly. Do you remember my telling you about the family spectre, the white man? Cecil asked. Well, it seems that the village drunkard, old Groby, was taking a short cut through our woods last night, or rather this morning, for he's a bit of a late going to rooster, and he got the shock of his life in one of the glades. He swears he saw the white man stealing about from tree to tree. By his way of it, he was near enough to see the thing clearly, all white, even the face. What a lark. You certainly seem to take your family spectre a bit lightly, Cecil. What's the cream of the jest? Cecil's face took on a vindictive expression. Oh, it gave me a chance of getting home on Maurice, after he'd given me the key of the street. I told him all about it and I rubbed in the old story. You know what I mean. The white man never appears except when the head of the family's on his last legs. Maurice didn't like it a bit. He looked a bit squeamish over it, and I came away leaving that sticking in his gills. Sir Clinton hardly concealed his distaste for this kind of thing. You flatter yourself, I expect. Maurice is hardly likely to waste any thought over superstitions of that sort. Cecil's expression still showed a tinge of malice. You'd wonder, he said. It's all very well for you to sneer at these affairs, but it looks a bit different when you yourself happen to be the object of them, I guess. It's easy to say superstition in a high-minded way, but if there's 1% chance that the superstition's going to hit you personally, then, you know, it rankles a bit. Anything to give pain is my motto where Maurice is concerned. Quite oblivious of Sir Clinton's rather disgusted expression, he laughed softly to himself for a moment or two. And the funniest thing in the whole affair, he went on, is that I know all about this white man. Can't you guess what it was? Sir Clinton shook his head. Why, don't you see? Cecil demanded, still laughing. What old Groby came across must obviously have been Maurice himself in his white Pierrot dress, coming back from the burglar hunt. That's what makes it so damned funny. Fancy Maurice getting the creeps on account of himself. It's as good a joke as I've heard for a while. He laughed harshly. You don't seem to see it. Well, well. Perhaps you're right. And now I must be getting back to the house. I've a lot of stuff to collect before I go off. He shook hands with Sir Clinton and moved off towards Ravensthorpe. The chief constable gazed after him for a moment or two. That young man's in a most unpleasant frame of mind, he commented to himself. He's obviously quite off his normal balance when he'd make a point of that kind of thing. I can't say I take much stock in brotherly love, but this is really overdoing the business. Both of them seem to have taken leave of ordinary feelings. It's just as well they're parting, perhaps. Rather moodily, he retraced his steps to where the inspector was directing the operations by the bank of the lakelet, but by the time he reached the group his face had taken on its normal expression. "Fishing still poor?" he demanded, as he came up. "Nothing so far, sir," the inspector confessed. "These rocks are the very deuce to work amongst. I've been running the grapnel over the same track 2 or 3 times, just in case we miss the thing the first shot. We've had no luck at all, unless you count this as a valuable find, a bit of limestone or something like that." He kicked a shapeless mass of white stone as he spoke. Sir Clinton stooped over it, a dripping mass about the size of a man's fist. The inspector watched him as he examined it, but Sir Clinton's face suggested neither interest nor satisfaction. "Might be a bit of marble that got swept over the top when they were putting up the balustrade in the old days," the inspector hazarded. Sir Clinton looked at it again and shook his head. "I doubt it," he said. "However, since it's the only thing you've fished up, you'd better keep it, Inspector. One never knows what may be useful. I might make a paperweight out of it as a souvenir." The inspector failed to see the point of the joke, but he laughed as politely as he could. "Very well, Sir Clinton, I'll see that it's put aside." He glanced over the chief constable's shoulder. "Here's Mr. Clifton coming, sir." Sir Clinton turned round to find that Michael Clifton had approached while he was engaged with the dragging operations. Leaving the group by the bank, he walked slowly to meet the advancing figure. "Good morning, Mr. Clifton. Come up to see how we're getting on, I suppose. There's nothing to report, I'm afraid." Drawn blank. Michael inquired, needlessly. "There ought to be something there, all the same." "It may have been only a stone," Sir Clinton pointed out. "You heard a splash. That's all we have to go on. And a stone would make that as well as anything else." "That's true," Michael admitted. "None of us saw the thing hit the water, so we've no notion what it was like. It might have been a stone for all we can tell. But why should the fellow pitch a brick into the water? That's what puzzles me." Before Sir Clinton could reply, a shout came from the bank, and the inspector waved to them to come down. "We've got something, sir," he called, as they drew nearer. Followed by Michael, Sir Clinton hurried up to the group at the water's edge. The inspector was kneeling down, carefully disentangling the grapnel from something white. At last he rose and held out his capture. Michael gave an exclamation. "A white jacket." A little further shaking of the material showed that it was a complete white Pierrot costume, except for the cap and shoes. The inspector spread it out on the grass to dry, after holding the jacket outspread in the air so that they could gauge its size by comparison with his own body. "That's what I've been hoping to get hold of, Inspector," Sir Clinton said. "I doubt if you'll find much more in the pool. But perhaps you'd better go on dragging for a while yet. Something else might turn up." He examined the costume carefully, but it was quite evident that there were no identifying marks on it. During the inspection, Michael showed signs of impatience, and as soon as he could he unostentatiously drew Sir Clinton away from the group. "Come up here, Mr. Clifton," the chief constable suggested, as he turned towards the hillock he had chosen earlier in the morning. "We can keep an eye on things from this place." He sat down and Michael, after a glance to see that they were out of earshot of the dragging party, followed his example. "What do you make of that?" he demanded eagerly. Sir Clinton seemed to have little desire to discuss the matter. "Let's be quite clear on one point before we begin," he reminded Michael. "I'm a chief constable, not a broadcasting station. My business is to collect information, not to throw it abroad before the proper time comes. You understand?" Rather dashed, Michael admitted the justice of this. "I'm a public servant, Mr. Clifton," Sir Clinton pointed out, his manner taking the edge off the directness of his remarks, "and I get my information officially. Obviously, it wouldn't be playing the game if I scattered that information around before the public service has had the use of it." "I see that well enough," Michael protested. "All I asked was what your own views are." Sir Clinton smiled, and there was a touch of mischief in his eye as he replied. Seeing that my conclusions are based on the evidence, at least I like to think so, you know, they're obviously part and parcel of my official knowledge. Hence I don't divulge them till the right moment comes. He paused to let this sink in, then added lightly. That's a most useful principle, I find. One often makes mistakes, and of course one never divulges them either, until the right time comes. It's curious, but I've never been able yet to satisfy myself that the right time has come in any case of the sort. Michael smiled in his turn, and Sir Clinton went on. But there's no reason why you shouldn't draw your own conclusions and give me the benefit of them. I'm not too proud to be helped, you know. For a moment Michael kept silence, as if considering what his next move should be. Sir Clinton had given him what might have looked like a snub, but Michael had acuteness enough to tell him that the matter was one of principle with the chief constable and not merely a pretext devised on the spur of the moment to suppress inconvenient curiosity. It just occurred to me, he confessed, that there's a possible explanation of that thing they've fished up. Do you remember that I found Maurice in the fairy house up above there? He indicated the cliff top with a gesture, and when I left him there he was still wearing a white costume like this one. So you told us last night, Sir Clinton confirmed. Now when Maurice turned up in the museum later on, Michael continued, he was wearing ordinary evening clothes. He got rid of the Pierrot dress in the meantime. That's true, Sir Clinton agreed. Isn't it possible, Michael went on, that after I left him, Maurice got over his troubles, whatever they were, and pitched his disguise over the edge here? This may quite well be it. Rather a rum proceeding, surely, was Sir Clinton's comment. Can you suggest any earthly reason why he should do a thing like that? I can't, Michael admitted, frankly. But the whole affair last night seemed to have neither rhyme nor reason in it, and after swallowing the escape of that beggar we were after, I'm almost prepared for anything in this neighborhood. I just put the matter before you. I can't fake up any likely explanation to account for it. Sir Clinton seemed to be reflecting before he spoke again. To tell you the truth, I was rather disappointed with the result of that drag. Quite obviously, this isn't official information, for you can see it with your own eyes. Quite obviously that Pierrot costume must have been wrapped round some weight or other, or it wouldn't have sunk to the bottom. And in the dragging the weight fell out. I could make a guess at what the weight was, but I wish we'd fished it up. It doesn't matter much, really, but one likes to get everything one can. Michael, unable to guess what lay behind this, kept silent in the hope that there was more to come, but the chief constable swung off to a fresh subject. Did you take a careful note of the costumes of the gang who helped you in the attempt to round the beggar up? Could you make a list of them if it became necessary? Michael considered for the best part of a minute before answering. Some of them I could remember easily enough, but not all, I'm sure. It was a bit confused, you know, and some of the crew turned up pretty late, when all my attention was focused on the final roundup. I really couldn't guarantee to give you an accurate list. Sir Clinton's nod indicated approval. That's what I like, he said. I'd rather have a definite no than a faked-up list that might mean nothing at all. But there's one point that's really important. Did you notice, among your assistants, anybody in white like the man you were hunting? Michael apparently had no need to pause before replying. No, he said definitely, I saw nobody of that sort. I suppose you mean Maurice. He certainly wasn't in the cordon when it went into the spinney or when it came out on the terrace. I'm absolutely sure of my ground there. But of course he may have been one of the late-comers. Almost as soon as we got to the terrace we had to sprint off down to the lakeside, you see, and he might quite well have been a bit slow in the chase and have reached the top only after we'd come down here. That's all I wanted to know, said Sir Clinton, with a finality which prevented any angling for further information. Michael evidently had no desire to outstay his welcome, for in a few minutes he rose to his feet. I think I'll go over to Ravensthorpe now, he said. I suppose you're not going to leave here for a while. The words recalled to Sir Clinton the fact that he had not yet congratulated Michael on his engagement. He hastened to repair the oversight. I was looking for you at the dance last night, he explained, after Michael had thanked him. But before I got hold of you, this burglary business cropped up, and I've had hardly a minute to spare since then. By the way, if you're going over to the house, you might tell Joan that I shall probably have to pay them a visit shortly, but I'll ring up and let them know when I'm coming. Michael nodded and turned away, skirting the lakelet on his way to Ravensthorpe. Sir Clinton sauntered over to the waterside and watched the dragging operations which were still going on. When he made his way back to the hillock again, Inspector Armadale followed him. There's another point that occurred to me, Sir, he explained. I think you told me that Polegate was wearing a harlequin's costume last night. That's correct, Sir Clinton confirmed. And what then? One difficulty I've had, the inspector went on, was to explain how the fellow in white got away from them all so neatly. I think I see now how it was done. Sir Clinton made no effort to conceal his interest. Yes, Inspector. Armadale obviously took this as complimentary. This is how I figure it out, sir. Polegate had a white jacket and Pierrot trousers on over his harlequin costume. At the end of the chase he bolted into the spinney and out onto the terrace above here. That gave him a breathing space. It took Mr. Clifton a minute or two to organize his cordon, and during that time the thief was hidden from them by the trees. That's obviously true, Sir Clinton admitted. If he did change his costume, it must have been at that moment. I expect he had a weight of some sort ready on the terrace, the inspector continued. When he'd stripped off his jacket and trousers, he wrapped them round the weight and pitched them over into the pool. That would make the splash they all heard. And after that? The inspector was evidently delighted with his idea. That leaves us with Polegate in harlequin dress on the terrace, with a minute or two to spare before the cordon was ready to move forward into the spinney. Admitted. Do you remember the camouflaged ships in the war, Sir Clinton? I sailed in one, if that's what you mean. Well, you know what they were like, all sorts of cockeyed streaks and colors mixed up in a regular tangle to destroy their real outlines. And what's a harlequin's costume? Isn't it the very same thing? Sir Clinton confirmed this with an historical allusion. You're quite correct, Inspector. As a matter of fact, the harlequin's dress was originally designed to represent invisibility. Nobody except Columbine was supposed to be able to see Harlequin, you know. Inspector Armadale hurried to his conclusion. What was to hinder Polegate, during that breathing space, getting back into the spinney? It was a moonlight night. You know what the spinney would be like under a full moon. It would be all dappled with spots of moonlight coming through the trees. And against a setting of that sort the harlequin costume would be next door to invisible. He'd only have to stand still in some checkered spot and no one would detect him. They were all hunting for a man dressed in white. None of them noticed him. None of them saw him, I guess. Much to the inspector's surprise, Sir Clinton shook his head. I'd be prepared to bet pretty heavily that someone saw him, he affirmed. The inspector looked at his chief for a moment, obviously taken aback. You think someone saw him? Then a flood of light from a fresh angle in his mind seemed to illuminate the question. You mean he had a confederate in the cordon? Someone who let him through and kept it dark? I never thought of that. You had me beaten there, Sir Clinton. And of course, now I see it, that's the simplest solution of the whole affair. If we can get a list of the people in the cordon, we'll be able to pick out the confederate before long. Sir Clinton damped his enthusiasm slightly. It won't be so easy to get that list, Inspector. Remember the confusion of the whole business, the hurry, the effect of moonlight, the masks, the costumes, and all the rest of it. You may be able to put a list together, but you'll have some difficulty yourself in believing that you've tracked down every possible person who was in the line. And if you miss one, he may be the man. You mean? Well, there's no harm in trying. I'll turn a sergeant on to gather all the news he can get. It'll be a good test of his capacity, then, even if nothing else comes out of it, Sir Clinton certified, carelessly. Chapter 8. The Murder in the Museum. Sir Clinton cut short the shrill ringing of his desk telephone by picking up the receiver. The chief constable speaking, he informed his inquirer. Michael Clifton's voice sounded over the wire. Can you come up to Ravensthorpe at once, Sir Clinton, or send Inspector Armadale? There's a bad business here. Mr. Foss has been murdered. I've taken care that no one has got off the premises, and I've seen to it that his body has been left as it was found. Sir Clinton glanced at his wristwatch. I'll drive across as soon as possible. See that things are left undisturbed, please. And collect all the people who can give any evidence, so that we needn't waste time hunting for them. Goodbye. He shifted the switch of his telephone and spoke again. Is Inspector Armadale here just now? He asked the constable who answered his call. Tell him I wish to see him in my room immediately. While waiting for Armadale, Sir Clinton had a few moments in which to consider the information he had just received. This looks like part 2 of the Ravensthorpe affair, he reflected. Foss's only connection with Ravensthorpe was the business of these Medusa medallions. First one has the theft of the replicas, Now comes the murder of this American agent. It's highly improbable that two things like that could be completely independent. His cogitation was interrupted by the entry of Armadale, and in a few words Sir Clinton gave him the fresh information which had come to hand. "We'll go up there at once in my car, Inspector. Get the necessary things together, please. Don't forget the big camera. We may need it. And the constable who does photography for us had better come along also." Inspector Armadale wasted no time. In a very few minutes they were on the road. As he drove, Sir Clinton was silent, and Armadale's attempt to extract further information from him was a complete failure. "You know as much as I do, Inspector," the chief constable pointed out. "Let's keep clear of any preconceived ideas until we see how the land lies up yonder." When they reached Ravensthorpe, they found Michael Clifton waiting for them at the door. "There are only two people who seem to know anything definite about things," he replied to the chief constable's first inquiry. "Joan's one of them, but she really knows nothing to speak of. The other witness is Foss's man, Marden's his name. Will you have a look at the body first of all, and then see Joan and this fellow?" Sir Clinton nodded his acquiescence, and the party followed Michael to the museum. Mould, the keeper, was again on guard at the door of the room, and Sir Clinton made a gesture of recognition as he passed in, followed by Armadale. A cursory glance showed Foss's body lying in one of the bays formed by the showcases round the wall. The inspector went forward, knelt down, and held a pocket mirror to the dead man's lips. "Quite dead, sir," he reported after a short time. "The police surgeon will be here shortly," Sir Clinton intimated. "If he's dead, we can postpone the examination of the body for a short time. Everything's to be left as it is until we come back. Turn the constable on to photograph the body's position in case we need it, though I don't think we shall. Now where's Miss Chasewater? We'd better get her version of the affair first. Then we can question the valet." Without being acutely sensitive to atmosphere, Michael Clifton could not help noticing a fresh characteristic which had come into the chief constable's manner. This was not the Sir Clinton with whom he was acquainted, the old friend of the Chasewater family, with his faintly whimsical outlook on things. Instead, Michael was now confronted by the head of the police in the district, engaged in a piece of official work and carrying it through in a methodical fashion, as though nothing mattered but the end in view. Followed by the two officials, Michael led the way to the room where Joan was waiting. The chief constable wasted no time in unnecessary talk. In fact, he plunged straight into business in a manner which suggested more than a touch of callousness. Only later on did Michael realize that in this, perhaps, Sir Clinton displayed more tact than was apparent at the moment. By his manner, he suggested that a murder was merely an event like any other, rather uncommon, perhaps, but not a thing which called for any particular excitement, and this almost indifferent attitude tended to relax Joan's overstrained nerves. "You didn't see the crime actually committed, of course?" Joan shook her head. "Shall I begin at the beginning?" she asked. Sir Clinton, by a gesture, invited her to sit down. He took a chair himself and pulled out a notebook. Inspector Armadale copied him in this. Michael remained standing near Joan's chair, as though to lend her his moral support. After thinking for a moment or two, Joan began her story. "Some time after lunch, I was sitting on the terrace with Mr. Foss. I forget what we were talking about, nothing of any importance. Soon after that, Maurice came out of the house and sat down. I was surprised to see him, for he'd arranged to play golf this afternoon. But he'd sprained his right wrist badly after lunch, it seems, and had phoned to put off his match. He sat nursing his wrist, and we began to speak of one thing and another. Then, I remember, Mr. Foss somehow turned the talk on to some of the things we have. It was mostly about Japanese things that they spoke, and Mr. Foss seemed chiefly interested in some of the weapons my father had collected. I remember they talked about a Sukasada sword we have and about the Muramasa short sword. Mr. Foss said that he would like to see them sometime. He thought that Mr. Keswick would be interested to hear about them." She broke off and seemed to be trying to remember the transitions of the conversation. Sir Clinton waited patiently, but at last she evidently found herself unable to recall any details of the next stage in the talk. "I can't remember how it came up. It was just general talk about things in our collection and things Mr. Foss had seen elsewhere, but finally they got on to the Medusa medallion somehow. Mr. Foss was telling Maurice how tantalizing it was to buy these things and pass them on to collectors when he'd like to keep them for himself if only he could afford it. Then it came out that he always took a rubbing of all the coins and medals he came across. I remember he made some little joke about his poor man's collection, or something like that. I forget exactly how it came about, but either he asked Maurice to let him have another look at the Leonardo medallions or Maurice volunteered to let him take rubbings there and then. I can't recall the exact way in which the suggestion was made. I wasn't paying much attention at the time. She looked up to see if Sir Clinton showed any sign of annoyance at incomplete information, but his face betrayed neither dissatisfaction nor approval. Inspector Armadale, though following the evidence keenly and making frequent notes, seemed to think that very little of her information was to the point. Then, Joan went on, I remember Mr. Foss getting up from his chair and saying, "If you'll wait a moment, I'll get the things." And he went away and left Maurice and me together. I said, "What's he gone for?" And Maurice said, "Some paper to take rubbings of the medallions and some stuff he uses for that, dubbin or something." In a few minutes, Mr. Foss came back again with some sheets of paper and some black stuff in his hand. I was interested in seeing how he did his rubbing or whatever you call it, so I went with them to the museum. And then Sir Clinton prompted. As they were evidently coming near the moment of the murder in Joan's narrative, it was clear that he wished to leave her no time to think of the crime itself. We went into the museum. Since that night of the masked ball, Maurice has removed most of the smaller articles of value from the cases and put them into the safe, so in order to get the medallions he had to open the safe. It's a combination lock, you know, and as I knew Maurice wouldn't like us to be at his elbow while he was setting the combination, I took Mr. Foss under my wing and led him over to where the Sukasada sword is hung on the wall. We looked at it for a few moments. I remember taking it out of its sheath to show the blade to Mr. Foss. Then I heard Maurice slamming the door of the safe, and when we went into the bay where it is, Maurice was there with the Leonardo medallions in his hand. "One moment," Sir Clinton interrupted. "You said it was a combination lock on the safe. Do you happen to know the combination?" Joan shook her head. "Maurice is the only one who knows that. He never told it to any of us." Sir Clinton invited her to continue. Maurice handed Mr. Foss one of the medallions and Mr. Foss took it over to the big central case, the one with the flat top. Then he began to take a rubbing of the medallion with his paper and black stuff. He didn't seem quite satisfied with his first attempt, so he had a second try at it. As we were watching him, he seemed to prick up his ears, and then he said, "There's someone calling for you, Miss Chasewater." I couldn't hear anything myself, but he explained that the voice was pretty far off. He had extra good hearing, I remember he said. He seemed very positive about it, so I went off to see what it was all about. "Was that the last time you saw him?" "Yes," said Joan, but she had obviously more to tell. "And then, as I was going away from the museum door, I met Mr. Foss's man, Marden. He had a small brown paper parcel in his hand. He stopped me and asked me if I knew where Mr. Foss was. Something about the parcel, I gathered, though I didn't stop to listen to him. I told him Mr. Foss was in the museum, and I went on to see if I could find who was calling. I searched about and came across Mr. Clifton, but I didn't hear anyone calling my name. Mr. Foss must have been mistaken." And then Michael Clifton evidently thought it unnecessary that Joan should bear the whole burden of giving evidence. At this point he broke in. "Miss Chasewater and I were together in the Winter Garden when I heard a shout of murder. I didn't recognize the voice at the time. I left Miss Chasewater where she was and made my way as quick as I could towards the voice. It came from the museum, so I hurried there. I found Foss on the floor with a dagger of some sort in his chest. He was gone, so far as I could see, before I came on the scene at all. The man Marden was in the room, tying up his hand. It was bleeding badly and he said he'd cut it on the glass of a case. I kept him under my eye till I could get a couple of keepers, and then I rang you up at the station." "What had become of Mr. Chasewater?" Sir Clinton asked, without showing that he attached more than a casual interest to the question. "That's the puzzle," Michael admitted. "I didn't see him anywhere in the museum at the moment and I've been hunting for him everywhere since then, but he's not turned up. He may have gone out into the grounds, of course, and left Foss alone in the museum, and possibly he had got out of earshot before the cry of murder was raised by the valet. I don't know." Sir Clinton saw that the inspector wished to ask a question, but he silenced him by a glance. "One more point, and we're done, I think," he said, turning to Joan. "Can you give me a rough idea of the time when the cry of murder was raised? I mean, how long was it after you had left the museum yourself?" Joan thought for a few seconds. "It took me 3 or 4 minutes before I came across Mr. Clifton, and we were together. How long would you say, Michael, before we heard the shout?" "Not more than 5 minutes," Michael suggested. "That's about it," Joan confirmed. That would make it about 8 or 9 minutes, roughly, between the time I left the museum and the time we heard the shout. About that, Michael agreed. Sir Clinton rose and closed his notebook. That's all you have to tell us? Everything that bears on the matter, so far as you know. Joan paused for a moment or two before replying. That's all that I can remember, she said at last, after an evident effort to recall any fresh details. I can't think of anything else that would be of use. You've no idea where your brother is? None at all, Joan answered. Then a thought seemed to strike her. You don't think Maurice had anything to do with this? She demanded, anxiously. He'll turn up shortly to speak for himself, I've no doubt, Sir Clinton said, as though to reassure her. Now that's all we need just now, so far as you're concerned. I'm going to take Mr. Clifton away for a few minutes, but he'll be back again almost immediately. With a reassuring smile, the chief constable excused himself and led the way to the door, followed by Michael and the inspector. As soon as he was out of the room, he turned to Michael. You're quite sure that Mr. Chasewater wasn't in the museum when you reached it? Michael considered carefully before replying. I don't see how he could have been. I glanced into all the bays, and you know there isn't cover enough for a cat in the place. Was the safe door open or shut? Did you notice? Michael again reflected before replying. Shut, I'm almost certain. Sir Clinton in his turn seemed to reflect for a moment or two. We'll have a look at this fellow Marden, now, I think, Inspector, if you'll bring him along to the museum. We'd better hear his tale on the spot. It'll save explanations about the positions of things. Inspector Armadale departed on his quest while Michael and the chief constable made their way to the scene of the crime. Suddenly Sir Clinton turned and confronted Michael. Have you any notion whatever as to where Maurice has gone? I want the truth. Michael was manifestly taken aback by the direct demand. I haven't a notion, he declared. He wasn't in the museum when I got there, so far as I know. You can put me on my oath over that, if you like. The chief constable scanned his face keenly, but made no comment on his statement. He led the way to the museum, and they had hardly passed through the door before Inspector Armadale returned with the valet. Marden appeared to be a man of about 30 years of age. Sir Clinton noticed that he carried himself well and did not seem to have lost his head in the excitement of the past hour. When he spoke, it was without any appreciable accent, and he seemed to take pains to be perfectly clear in his evidence. Sir Clinton, by an almost imperceptible gesture, handed over the examination of the valet to the inspector. Armadale pulled out his notebook once more. What's your name? He demanded. Thomas Marden. How long have you been in Mr. Foss's service? Since he arrived here from America, about 3 months ago. How did he come to engage you? Advertisement. You knew nothing about him before that? Nothing. Where was he living then? At 474A Gunners Mansions, SW. It's a service flat. He still has that flat? Yes. How did he spend his time? The valet seemed astonished by the question. I don't know. None of my business. Inspector Armadale was not to be turned aside. You must have known whether he stayed in the flat or went out regularly at fixed times. Marden seemed to see what was wanted. You mean, did he go out to an office every day? No, he came and went just when it suited him. Had he much correspondence? Letters? Just about what one might expect. The inspector looked up gloomily. So far, he had not got much to go upon. What do you mean by, just what one might expect? He got some letters every day, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes half a dozen. Just what one might expect. Have you any idea whether they were business letters or merely private correspondence? Marden seemed annoyed by the question. How should I know? He demanded, stiffly. It's not my business to pry into my employer's affairs. It's your business to read the addresses on the envelopes to see that the postman hasn't left wrong letters. Did you notice nothing when you did that? Were the addresses mainly typewritten or written by hand? He got bills and advertisements with the address typewritten, like most of us, and 1 or 2 letters came addressed by hand. Did you notice the stamps? Some were American, of course. So it comes to this, Inspector Armadale concluded. He was not carrying on a big business from the flat. Most of his letters were ordinary bills and so forth, but he had some private correspondence as well, and part of his correspondence was with America? Why couldn't you tell us that straight off, instead of having it dragged out of you? The valet was quite unruffled by the inspector's tone. I hadn't put two and two together the way you do. They were just letters to me. I didn't think anything about them. Inspector Armadale showed no appreciation of this indirect tribute to his powers. Had he many visitors? Not at the flat. He may have met his friends in the restaurant downstairs for all I know. Do you remember any visitors at the flat? No. The inspector seemed to recollect something he had missed. Did he get any telegrams? Yes. Frequently. Fairly often. You've no idea of the contents of these wires. Marden obviously took offense at this. You asked me before if I pried into his affairs, and I told you I didn't. How often did these wires arrive? The inspector demanded, taking no notice of Marden's annoyance. Perhaps once or twice a week. Did he bet? The inspector inquired, as though it had just struck him that the telegrams might thus be explained. I know nothing about that. Armadale went off on a fresh tack. Did he seem to be well off for money? He paid me regularly, if that's what you mean. He had a car and a chauffeur, hadn't he? Yes. Were they his own or simply hired? I don't know. Not my business. The Gunners Mansion's flats are expensive. They get the name of it. I don't know what he paid. You don't seem to have had much curiosity, Marden. I'm not paid for being curious. The inspector put down his pencil and reflected for a moment or two. Have you any idea of his address in America? Not my business. Did he write many letters? I couldn't say. None of my business. You can at least say whether he gave you any to post. He didn't. Have you anything else you can tell us about him? Marden seemed to think carefully before he replied. All his clothes were split new. Anything else? He carried a revolver, I mean an automatic. What size was it? About that length. The valet indicated the length approximately with his hands, and winced slightly as he moved the bandaged one. HM. A .38 or .45, Armadale commented. Too big for a .22, anyway. He took up his pencil again. Now come to this afternoon. Begin at lunchtime and go on. Marden reflected for a moment, as though testing his memory. I'd better begin before lunch. Mr. Foss came to me with a parcel in his hand and asked me to take it over to Hincheldean Post Office. He wanted it registered. He offered to let me take the car if I wished, but I preferred to walk over. I like the fresh air. And then, demanded the inspector with an unconscious plagiarism of his chief. Immediately after lunch, I set out and walked through the grounds towards Hincheldean village. I didn't hurry. It was a nice afternoon for a walk. By and by I met a keeper, and he told me I couldn't go any farther in that direction. He'd orders to turn back anyone, he said. I talked to him for a minute or two, and explained where I was going, and I pulled the parcel out of my pocket as a guarantee of good faith. He didn't know me, you see. And when I got the parcel out, I noticed the label quite by chance. Ah, you do look at addresses after all, interjected the inspector. Quite by chance, Marden went on, without taking any notice of the thrust. And I saw that Mr. Foss had made a mistake. How did you know that? Inspector Armadale demanded, with the air of a cat pouncing on a mouse. You said you'd taken no interest in his correspondence, and yet you knew this parcel was directed to a wrong address. Curious, isn't it? Marden did not even permit himself to smile as he discomfited the inspector. He'd left out the name of the town. An obvious oversight when he was writing the label. Well, go on, growled the inspector, evidently displeased at losing his score. As soon as I saw that, I knew it was no good taking the thing to the post office as it was. So I asked the keeper a question or two about the shortest way to Hincheldean without getting onto the barred ground. Then I turned and came home again, intending to ask Mr. Foss to complete the address on the parcel. What time was it when you reached here again? Marden considered for a while. I couldn't say precisely. Sometime round about 3:30 or a bit later. I didn't look at the time. What did you do then? I hunted about for Mr. Foss, but he didn't seem to be in the house. At last, when I was just giving it up, I met Miss Chasewater coming away from this room, and she told me that Mr. Foss was inside. She went away, and I came to the door. It was half open and I could hear voices inside, Mr. Foss and Mr. Chasewater from the sound. I thought they'd soon be coming out and that I'd get Mr. Foss as he passed me, so I waited, instead of interrupting them. How long did you wait? Only a minute or two, so far as I can remember. You could hear them talking. I could hear the sound of their voices. I couldn't hear what they said. There's an echo or something in this room and all I heard was the tone they were speaking in. What sort of tone do you mean? Marden paused as though searching for an adjective. It seemed to me an angry tone. They raised their voices. As if they were quarreling. Like that. And then I heard Mr. Chasewater say, "So that's what you're after." Then I heard what sounded like a scuffle and a gasp. I was taken aback, of course. Who wouldn't be? I stood stock still with the parcel in my hand for a moment or two. Then I got my head back and I pushed open the door and rushed into the room. "Be careful here," Sir Clinton interrupted. "Don't try to force your memory. Tell us exactly what comes back into your mind." Marden nodded. "When I got into the room here," he went on, "the first thing I saw was Mr. Chasewater. He had his back to me and was just turning the corner here." Marden walked across and indicated the end of the bay beyond the one which contained the safe, the last recess in the room at the end opposite from the door. "He went round this corner in a hurry. That's the last I saw of him." Marden's face betrayed his amazement even at the recollection. "Never mind that just now," said Sir Clinton. "Tell us what you did yourself." "I couldn't see Mr. Foss at the first glance, but when I got near the corner where I'd seen Mr. Chasewater, I saw Mr. Foss lying on the floor. I thought he'd slipped or something, and I went over to give him a hand up. Then I saw a big knife or a dagger through his chest and some blood on his mouth. As I was hurrying over to his side, I slipped on the parquet, it's very slippery, and down I came. I put out my hand to save myself and my fist broke the glass in one of these cases. When I got up again, my hand was streaming with blood. It's a nasty gash. So I pulled out my handkerchief and wrapped it around my hand before I did anything else. It was simply gushing with blood and I thought of it first of all." Marden held up his roughly swathed hand in proof. "I got to my feet again and went over to Mr. Foss. By that time he was either dead or next door to it. He didn't move. I didn't touch him, for I saw well enough he was done for. Then I went to the door and shouted murder, as hard as I could. Then while I was shouting, it struck me as queer that Mr. Chasewater had disappeared." "It didn't occur to you that he might have slipped out of the room while your back was turned, when you were busy over Mr. Foss?" demanded Inspector Armadale in a hostile tone. Marden shook his head. "It didn't occur to me at all, because I knew it hadn't happened. No one could have got out of the room without my seeing him." "Go on with your story, please," Sir Clinton requested. "There's nothing more to tell. I kept shouting murder, and I searched the room here while I was doing it. I found nothing." "Was the safe door closed when you saw it first?" Sir Clinton inquired. "Yes, it was. I thought perhaps Mr. Chasewater might be inside, with the door pulled to, so I tried the handle. It was locked." Sir Clinton put a further inquiry. "You heard only 2 voices in the room before you burst in?" A new light seemed to be thrown by this question across Marden's mind. "I heard only 2 people speaking, Mr. Foss and Mr. Chasewater, but of course I couldn't swear that only 2 people were in the room. That's what you meant, isn't it?" Inspector Armadale caught the drift of the inquiry. "I suppose if one man can disappear in a mysterious way, there's nothing against 2 men vanishing in the same way," he hazarded. "So all you can really tell us is that Mr. Foss and Mr. Chasewater were here at any rate, and possibly there were other people as well." "I couldn't swear to any one except these 2, Marden was careful to state. "Another point," Sir Clinton went on. "Have you any idea whether Mr. Foss came into contact with a person or persons outside the house during his stay here? I mean people known to him before he came to Ravensthorpe." "I couldn't say." "None of your business, I suppose?" Inspector Armadale put in, with an obvious sneer. "None of my business, as you say," Marden returned, equably. "I wasn't engaged as a detective." "Well, this question falls into your department," Sir Clinton intervened, as Armadale showed signs of losing his temper. "What costume was Mr. Foss wearing on the night of the masked ball? You must know that." Marden replied without hesitation. "He was got up as a cowpuncher. He hired the costume from London when he heard about the fancy dress. It was a pair of cowboy trousers, big heavy things with fringes on them, a leather belt with a pistol holster on it, a colored shirt, a neckcloth, and a flappy cowboy hat. Rather a clumsy rig out, then. Marden seemed to find difficulty in repressing a smile. It was as much as he could do to walk at all, until he got accustomed to the things. He told me it gave him a good excuse for not dancing. He wasn't a dancing man, he said. He carried a revolver, you say. Did you ever see any sign that he was afraid of anything of this sort happening to him? I don't understand. How could I know what he was afraid of or what he wasn't? It was none of my business. Sir Clinton's smile took the edge off Marden's reply. Oh, I think one might make a guess, he said, if one kept one's eyes open. A terrified man would give himself away somehow or other. Then either he wasn't afraid or else I don't keep my eyes open. I saw nothing of the sort. Sir Clinton reflected for a moment or two. He glanced at Armadale. Any more questions you'd like to put? No? Then that will do, Marden. Of course there'll be an inquest and your evidence will be required at it. You can stay on here until you're needed. I'll see Miss Chasewater about it. But for the present you've given us all the help you can. Unless you've any more questions you want to ask, Marden suggested. Sir Clinton shook his head. No, I think I've got all I need for the present. Thanks. I may want you again later on, of course. Marden waited for nothing further, but left the room pursued by a slightly vindictive glance from Inspector Armadale. When he had disappeared, Sir Clinton turned to Michael Clifton. Hadn't you better go back to Joan, now? She must be rather nervous after this shock. Michael came to himself with a slight start when the chief constable addressed him. Hitherto his role had been purely that of a spectator, and he had been so wrapped up in it that it came as a faint surprise to find himself directly addressed. Throughout the proceedings he had been semi-hypnotized by the deadly matter-of-fact way in which the police were going about their work. When he had first heard of the murder, he had felt as though something unheard of had invaded Ravensthorpe. Of course murders did take place, one read about them in the newspapers. But the idea that murder could actually be done in his own familiar environment had come to him with more than a slight shock. The normal course of things seemed suddenly diverted. But during the last 10 minutes he had been a witness of the beginning of the police investigation, and the invincible impression of ordinariness had begun to replace the earlier nightmare quality in his mind. Here were a couple of men going about the business as though it were of no more tragic character than a search for a lost dog. It was part of their work to hunt out a solution of the affair. They were no more excited over it than a chess player looking for the key move in a problem. The cool, dispassionate way in which the chief constable had handled the affair seemed to strike a fresh note and to efface the suggestions of the macabre side of things which had been Michael's first impression of the matter. The dance of death retreated gradually into the background in the face of all the minute questionings about letters, and visits, and parcels, these commonplace things of everyday life. If I can be of no use here, he said, I think I'd better go. He hesitated for a moment as a fresh thought struck him. By the way, how much of this is confidential? Sir Clinton looked at him with an expressionless face. I think I may leave that to your discretion. It's not for broadcasting, at any rate. What about Maurice? Michael persisted. I'd leave Maurice out of it as far as possible, said Sir Clinton, in obvious dismissal. Now, Inspector, I think we'd better have a look at the late Mr. Foss. Michael retreated from the room as they turned towards the body on the floor. Leave Maurice out of it, he thought, as he walked at a snail's pace towards the room where he had left Joan. That's a nice bit of advice. If you leave Maurice out of it, there seems to be nothing left in it. Now what the devil am I to say to her? If I say nothing, she'll jump to the worst conclusion, and if I say anything at all, she'll jump to the same. Chapter 9. The Maramasa Sword. As the door closed behind Michael Clifton, the chief constable turned to the inspector. Now we can get to business, Inspector. Let's have a look round the place at leisure, and perhaps the surgeon will turn up before we reach the body itself. Followed by Armadale, he stepped over to the bay containing the corpse of Foss and began methodically to inspect the surroundings. This must have been the case that Marden slipped against when he cut his hand, the inspector pointed out. There's a big hole in the glass and some blood on the broken edges of the gap. Oh, yes, there's blood enough to suit most people, Sir Clinton admitted, with a glance towards the shattered case. But he seemed less interested in the glass than in the floor surface, for he moved slowly to and fro, evidently trying to place himself so that the sunlight from the window was reflected up to him from the parquet. After a moment or two, he seemed satisfied. That part of Marden's story seems true enough. He did slip here. If you come across, you'll see a line where the polish of the parquet has been taken off by some hard part of his shoe. You won't be able to spot it unless you make a mirror of the floor. The inspector in his turn moved over and satisfied himself of the existence of the faint mark. That confirms part of his story, he admitted, grudgingly. There's a lot of blood about, quite apart from the stuff from the body. One might make something out of that. Suppose we try, Sir Clinton suggested. Assume that he cut his hand here on the glass. He'd be all asprawl on the floor, and the first thing he'd do would be to put his hands down to help himself up. That would account for these biggish patches here, under the case. Then a foot or so away you see those round marks of droplets with tiny splashes radiating from them with a fair regularity all round. These must have been made by drops falling from his hand while he stood still, no doubt while he was feeling with the other hand for his handkerchief to stanch the bleeding. The inspector indicated his agreement. After he'd got it fixed up, one might expect him to go over and look at Foss. He'd gone down on the floor, you remember, while he was hurrying to Foss's assistance. There's no sign of that, Armadale hastened to point out. I can't see any blood drops round about the body. Oh, don't be in too much of a hurry, Inspector. Perhaps they fell in the pool of Foss's own blood or, more probably, his handkerchief soaked up any blood that flowed just then. Sir Clinton, still with his eyes on the ground, began to cast about in search of further traces. Ah, here are a couple of drops at the end of the bay. Have a look at them, Inspector. Armadale knelt down and examined the clots. Made on his way to the door, probably, he suggested. They might have been, if he was swinging his arms as one does when one walks freely, but one doesn't usually swing the arm when there's a fresh wound in the hand, I think. These aren't round blobs like the others. They're elongated, and all the splashing from them is at one end, the end towards the safe. His hand, when they were made, was moving towards the safe's bay, whatever his body was doing. Sir Clinton made a rough measurement of the distance between the two drops. If they'd been nearer together or further apart, then each of them might have been made while his arm was going backwards in its natural swing while he was walking towards the door. But the distance between them won't fit that. You'll see at once if you try walking over the ground yourself, Inspector, for you're just about Marden's height and your stride must be nearly the same as his. He said something about going to the safe and trying the handle, the inspector admitted, grudgingly. So far, his tale's got some support. Sir Clinton smiled covertly at Armadale's obvious desire to pick holes in the valet's narrative. Well, let's find out how it happened, Sir Clinton suggested. He evidently passed this bay and went on towards the next one, where the safe is. We'll follow his example. They turned the corner of the showcase and stepped over to the safe door. There's a trace of blood on the handle, true enough, the inspector admitted. But I'm not sure he told the truth about why he came to the safe. Sir Clinton inspected the smear of blood on the handle, but he seemed to attach very little importance to it. I suppose one mustn't jump to conclusions and assume that everything's all above board, he conceded. But even if we keep open minds, wouldn't it be the most natural thing in the world for Marden to try the safe door? Remember what had happened according to his story. Mr. Chasewater was in the room, for Marden saw him with his own eyes. Mr. Chasewater turned the corner of a bay, the one next this, and then Marden lost him for good. If you'd been in Marden's place, wouldn't you have searched about, and then, finding no trace of the missing man, wouldn't you have jumped to the conclusion that he might be hidden in the safe? And wouldn't you have given the handle a pull, just to make sure the safe was really locked and that Mr. Chasewater wasn't hiding inside it? I suppose so, conceded the inspector, evidently dissatisfied. I expect his tale isn't complete, of course. He could hardly give every detail. It would be a bit suspicious if he had, I think. If his tale had been absolutely complete in every detail, I'd be inclined to suspect a previously prepared recitation rather than an account of the facts. In a case of this sort, one could hardly expect a watertight narrative, could one? He continued his examination of the floor, but there seemed to be no other bloodstains of any importance. Now let's have a glance at the body, he suggested. We needn't shift it till the surgeon comes, but we can see what's to be seen without altering its position in the meanwhile. The inspector was the first to reach the spot, and as he knelt down beside the corpse he gave an exclamation of surprise. Here's an automatic pistol, sir. It's lying almost under the body, but I can see the muzzle. It looks like a .38 caliber. Leave it there. We'll get at it later. Sir Clinton examined the body itself. The cause of death seemed obvious enough, for the weapon still remained in the wound. A glance at it set the chief constable's eye ranging over the museum cases. He retreated from the bay and searched for a time until he found what he was looking for, an empty sheath in an unlocked case. Without touching the sheath, he scanned the Japanese inscription on its surface. So that's the thing. The inspector had come across to his side and stood looking at the sheath. So the thing's one of the specimens? He asked. Yes. Don't touch it, Inspector. We may as well see whose fingerprints are on it, though it's quite on the cards that it's been handled by other people lately as well as the murderer. It's rather a show specimen, you see, one of Muramas's making. This was the sword they were discussing when they were out on the terrace. Muramas's weapons have the name of being unlucky, and this one seems to bear out the legend. The inspector looked at the sheath with apparent care, but his thoughts seemed to be elsewhere. Nobody could have got away from here through the windows, he observed, rather irrelevantly. They're all barred outside, and the catches are fast on the sashes. Evidently Sir Clinton had noticed this in the course of his previous search, for he gave a tacit assent to the inspector's statement without even glancing up at the windows. Here are the sheets of rubbing paper that Foss was using, the inspector went on, picking them up as he spoke. They'll have his fingerprints on them, so I'll stow them away. We might need them. One never knows. We can get actual prints from the body if we need them, Sir Clinton pointed out. You don't suppose it's a suicide case, do you? The inspector was too wary to throw himself open to attack. He contented himself with putting the papers away carefully in his pocketbook. Fingerprints will be useful, though, Sir Clinton went on. At the earliest possible moment, Inspector, I want you to get prints from the fingers of everyone in the house. Start with Miss Chasewater. She'll agree to let you take hers without any trouble, and after that you can go on to Mr. Clifton and so down the scale. We've no authority for insisting, of course, but you can make a note if anyone objects. I expect you'll get the lot without difficulty. At this moment Mould opened the door to admit the police surgeon, and Sir Clinton broke off in order to explain the state of affairs to him. Dr. Greenlaw was a businesslike person who wasted no time. While Sir Clinton was speaking, he knelt down beside the corpse and made a cursory examination of it. When he rose to his feet again, he seemed satisfied. That sword appears to have entered the thorax between the 5th and 6th ribs, he pointed out. It's pierced the left lung, evidently. You notice the blood foam on his lips? And most probably it's penetrated right into the heart as well. It looks as if it had, but of course I'll need to carry out a PM before I can give you exact details. I suppose we can take out the sword before we shift the body, asked the inspector. We want to examine it before anyone else touches it. Certainly, Greenlaw replied. You can see for yourselves what happened. He was struck from the front by a right-hand man, a fairly heavy blow, I should judge from the depth to which that sword has buried itself. There's no sign of a twist in the wound, which looks as though he went down under it at once. Quite possibly the base of the skull may have been fractured on the floor by the force of his fall. We'll see when we come to the PM. But in any case that wound alone would be quite sufficient to cause almost immediate death. It's a blade almost as broad as a bayonet, as you can see. I'll go into the whole thing carefully when I can make a thorough examination. You'll have him sent down to the mortuary, of course. As soon as we've finished our work here. Good. I'll make a note or two now, if you don't mind. Then I'll leave you to get on. As things are, there's nothing there which you couldn't see for yourselves. He took out a pocketbook and began to jot down his notes. Just a moment, Doctor, Sir Clinton interposed. I've got a patient for you here. I'd like you to have a look at his hand and bandage up some cuts before you go. Greenlaw nodded in agreement and went on with his note-taking. Now, Inspector, Sir Clinton continued, we'd better get this sword out. Be sure to take all the care you can not to rub out any fingerprints. Armadale obeyed, and after some cautious maneuvers he succeeded in withdrawing the weapon, which he laid carefully on the top of the central showcase. Now we can have a look at him, Sir Clinton said. You don't mind our shifting the position of the body, Doctor? Greenlaw closed his notebook and prepared to assist them if necessary. Begin with the contents of his pockets, Inspector, Sir Clinton suggested. The blade's gone clean through his left breast pocket, the inspector pointed out. He felt the outside of the pocket gingerly with his fingers. Nothing there except his handkerchief, so far as I can feel. It's all soaked with his blood. I'll leave that to the last. I want to keep my hands clean while I go over the rest. He wiped his fingertips carefully on his own handkerchief and continued his search. Right-hand breast pocket, a note case. He drew it out and handed it to Sir Clinton, who opened it and counted the contents. £357 in notes, he announced at length. That's a fair sum to be carrying about with one. 10 visiting cards, J.B. Foss, with no address. He crossed over to the central case and put down the note case thoughtfully. The left-hand waistcoat pockets are saturated with blood, Armadale continued. I'll leave them over for the present. Top right-hand waistcoat pocket, empty. Lower right-hand waistcoat pocket, a small penknife and a toothpick. Not much blood here. He was lying slightly on his left side and it must have flowed in that direction, I suppose. Right-hand jacket pocket, outside, nothing. I'll take the trousers now. Right-hand pocket, keyring and a purse. He handed them to Sir Clinton, who examined them in turn before putting them on the central case. Only keys of suitcases here, the chief constable reported. We haven't come across the latch key of his flat, if you notice. He counted the contents of the purse. 8 and 6pence and 1 10-shilling note. The inspector proceeded with his examination. Here's something funny. He's got a smallish pocket over his hip, just below the trouser button. That's unusual. But it's empty, he added, after an eager search. Let me look at that, Sir Clinton demanded. He stooped down and inspected the pocket closely, then stood up and passed his hand across the corresponding spot on his own clothes. As he did so, Armadale noticed a peculiar expression pass across the chief constable's face, as though some new idea had dawned upon him and had cleared up a difficulty. But Sir Clinton divulged nothing of what was passing in his mind. Make quite sure it's empty, he said. Armadale turned the little pocket inside out. There's nothing there, he pointed out. It wouldn't hold much, it's hardly bigger than a ticket pocket. He looked at the pocket again, evidently puzzled by the importance which the chief constable attached to it. It's a silly place to have a pocket, he said at last. It's not like the old-fashioned fob. That was kept tight shut by the pressure of your body. This thing's mouth is loose and it's simply a gift to a pickpocket. I think we'll probably find another of the same kind on the other side, Sir Clinton contented himself with saying. Let's get on with the rest of them. Armadale turned the body slightly and put his hand into the hip pocket. It's empty, too, he announced. It's a very loose pocket with no flap on it. I expect he carried his pistol there and he had the pocket built for easy handling of his gun. He looked at the .38 automatic which had been disclosed as he turned the body. That wouldn't have fitted into the little pocket, he pointed out. The pistol's far too big for the opening. Sir Clinton nodded his agreement with this view. He didn't use it for his pistol. Now, the left-hand pockets, please. You can wash your hands as soon as you've gone through them. Inspector Armadale stolidly continued his investigation. Left-hand breast pocket in jacket, he announced. Nothing but his handkerchief, saturated with blood. He handed it to Sir Clinton, who inspected it carefully before putting it with the rest of the collection. No marks on it, either initials or laundromark, he said. Evidently been bought and used without marking. Ticket pocket, empty, the inspector went on, withdrawing his fingers from it. Top left waistcoat pocket, a self-filling swan pen and a metal holder for same. Lower left waistcoat pocket, an amber cigarette holder. Not much to go on there. He turned to the trousers. Left-hand trouser pocket, 5 coppers. Handing them over, he proceeded. Your notion's quite right, sir. There's another of these side pockets here. But it's empty like the other one. Instead of replying, Sir Clinton gingerly picked up the automatic pistol from the floor and placed it along with the other objects on the central case. You'd better examine that for fingerprints, Inspector, he suggested. I leave you to make the arrangements about taking the body down to the mortuary. The sooner the better. Now, Doctor, we'll get your patient for you, if the inspector will be good enough to bring him to the lavatory nearby, where you can get his wounds patched up. Inspector Armadale soon produced Marden, who seemed rather surprised at being summoned again. It's all right, Marden, Sir Clinton assured him. It merely struck me that when there was a doctor on the premises you ought to have these cuts of yours properly fixed up. Dr. Greenlaw speedily removed the temporary bandage which the valet had improvised. I'll need to put some stitches into this, he said, as the extent of the injury became evident. Luckily these glass cuts are clean-edged. You'll hardly see the scar after a time. Sir Clinton inspected the wounds sympathetically. You've made a bit of a mess of your hand, Marden, he commented. It's just as well I thought of getting Dr. Greenlaw to look after you. Marden seemed to have been looking for an opening. I'm glad you called me up again, sir, he explained. I've just thought of 2 other points about this affair. Yes. While the doctor was cleaning and disinfecting the wounds, Marden addressed himself to the chief constable. I forgot to say, sir, that when I got back to the house I found Mr. Foss's car waiting for him. I said a word or 2 to the chauffeur as I passed. It only struck me afterwards that this might be important. I forgot about it at the time. Quite right to tell us, Sir Clinton confirmed. The second thing was what the chauffeur told me. He'd been ordered to wait for Mr. Foss, it seems, and he got the idea that Mr. Foss was leaving Ravensthorpe this afternoon for good. I was surprised by that, for I'd heard nothing about it from Mr. Foss. He flinched slightly with the smart of his wounds, as Greenlaw washed them carefully. Sir Clinton seemed to be struck by a fresh idea. Before the doctor bandages you up, would you mind if we took your fingerprints, Marden? I'm asking everyone to let us take theirs, and this seems to be the best chance we shall have of getting yours, you see? Of course, if you object, I've no power to insist on it. I've no objections, sir. Why should I have? Then you might take impressions of the lot, Inspector, Sir Clinton suggested. Don't spend too much time over it. We must get the bandages on this hand as quick as possible. Inspector Armadale hurried away for his outfit and soon set to work to take the valet's fingerprints. While he was thus engaged, a fresh suggestion seemed to occur to Sir Clinton. By the way, Marden, you have that parcel which Mr. Foss sent to the post. I can give you it in a moment, sir, once the doctor has finished with my hand. Very good. I'd like to see it. The chief constable waited patiently until Marden's hand was completely bandaged, then he dispatched the valet for the parcel. When it was forthcoming, he dismissed Marden again. The doctor took his leave, and Armadale was left alone with Sir Clinton. Now let's see what Foss was sending off, Inspector. Cutting the string, Sir Clinton unwrapped the paper and disclosed a small cardboard box. Inside, on a layer of cotton wool, was a wristwatch. Further search failed to bring to light any enclosed note. I suppose he was sending it to be cleaned, the inspector hazarded. Probably he wrote a letter by the same post. Let's have a look at it, Inspector. Be careful not to mark it with your fingers. Sir Clinton took the watch up and examined it closely. It looks fairly new to need repair. He held it to his ear. It's going. Not much sign of damage there. Perhaps it needed regulating, Armadale suggested. Perhaps. Sir Clinton's tone was non-committal. Take a note of the time as compared with your own watch, Inspector, and just check whether it's going fast or slow in a few hours. Try it for fingerprints along with the rest of the stuff. He replaced it gently in its bed of cotton wool and closed the box, taking care not to finger the cardboard. Now, if you'll send for the chauffeur, we may get something from him. But the chauffeur proved a most unsatisfactory witness. He admitted that Foss had ordered him to bring round the car at 3.15 and wait for further orders, but he was unable to give any clear account of the talk he had with his employer when the order was given. I can't remember what he said exactly, but I got the notion he was leaving here today. I'm dead sure of that, for I packed up my own stuff and had it ready to go off at a moment's notice. It's on the grid of the car now. I was so taken aback that I haven't thought of unpacking it. Sir Clinton could get nothing further out of the man, and he was eventually dismissed. Now we'll have a run over the late Mr. Foss's goods, the chief constable proposed, when they had dismissed the chauffeur. But the search of Foss's bedroom yielded at first nothing of much interest. This doesn't look as if that chauffeur had been telling the truth, Armadale pointed out, when they found all Foss's clothes arranged quite normally in wardrobe and drawers. Foss himself had made no preparations for moving, that's evident. I'll see that chauffeur again and go into the matter more carefully. You might as well, Sir Clinton concurred. But I doubt if you'll get him to shift from his story. He seemed to be very clear about the main point, though he was weak in details. They subjected all Foss's belongings to a careful scrutiny. No name marked on any of the linen, no tags on any of the suits, no labels inside the jacket pockets, Inspector Armadale pointed out. He seems to have been very anxious not to advertise his identity. And no papers of any sort. It looks a bit queer, doesn't it? As he spoke, he noticed a small leather case standing in a corner. Hello, here's an attaché case. Perhaps his papers are in it. He crossed over and picked up the case, but as he did so an expression of surprise crossed his face. "This thing's as heavy as lead. It must weigh 10 or 12 pounds at least." "It's not an attaché case," Sir Clinton pointed out. "Look at the ends of it." Armadale turned the case round in his hand. At the upper part of one end the leather had been cut away, disclosing a small ebonite disc rather more than an inch in diameter and pierced with a pattern of tiny holes. At the opposite end of the case there were two small holes side by side and a larger one above. An examination showed brass sockets inside which seemed meant for the reception of plugs. "You'd better get his keys, Inspector. Probably the key of this thing will be on the ring." With his curiosity raised to an acute pitch, Armadale went off in search of the keyring, and was soon back again with it in his hand. "Now we'll see what it is," he said, as he turned the key in the case's lock and pressed the opening spring. The lifting of the lid disclosed a wooden casing fitted with a couple of hinged doors, an open recess in which were two levers, and a hinged metal plate, on which was an inscription. Armadale read it aloud uncomprehendingly. "Marconi Otophone. INST. No. SO 1164. What the deuce is this?" Sir Clinton put out his hand and lifted the hinged metal plate, disclosing below two wireless valves in their sockets. "Some wireless gadget," the inspector ejaculated. "Now what could he possibly have wanted with a thing like that?" Sir Clinton examined the instrument with interest, then he closed the case. "We'll take this along with us, Inspector." Then, with a sudden change of mind, he contradicted himself. "No, we'll leave it here for the present. That will be much better." Somewhat mystified by this change of intention, the inspector agreed. Sir Clinton's manner did not invite questions. "I think we had better see Miss Chasewater again. There are one or two questions I'd like to put to her, Inspector, and you had better be there." In a minute or two, Joan was found, with Michael Clifton in attendance. Sir Clinton did not think it worth while to sit down. "Just a couple of points I want to ask about. First of all, is there any record of the combination which opens the lock of the safe in the museum?" Joan shook her head. "Maurice was the only one of us who knew it. My father did leave a note of it, but I remember that Maurice destroyed that. He specially wished to keep it to himself." "Another point," Sir Clinton went on. "Did Foss know, on the night of the burglary, which of the rows contained the real medallions and which row the replicas were in?" Joan reflected for a moment or two before replying. "He must have known. Maurice had shown him the things once at least, if not oftener, and I know there was no secret as to which were the real things and which were the counterfeits." Sir Clinton seemed satisfied with this information. "One last thing," he continued. "I suppose you could show me where your brother keeps his correspondence. We must get hold of Keswick's address and notify him about Foss's death, and there seems no way of doing it as quick as this one. If the papers aren't locked up, perhaps I could see them now." It appeared that the letters were available and Sir Clinton turned them over rapidly. "Fifth Avenue? That's satisfactory." He put the papers back in their place. "There's just one thing more. I'm going to put a constable on guard at the door of the museum for a while, day and night for a day or two, perhaps. You won't mind?" "Certainly not. Do as you wish." Sir Clinton acknowledged the permission. Then, as though struck by an afterthought, he inquired, "Have you Cecil's address?" Joan shook her head. "He said he'd let me know where he was staying, but he hasn't written. Perhaps he hasn't settled down yet. He may be staying at an hotel for a day or two. Please ring me up as soon as he sends word." Joan promised to do this, and Sir Clinton continued, "By the way, Inspector Armadale wishes to take the fingerprints of everyone in the house. Would you mind setting an example and having yours taken along with the rest? If you do it, then it will be easier for us to get the others. They won't be suspicious when they hear that it's a general inquisition." Both Joan and Michael consented without ado. "The inspector will be with you in a moment or two," Sir Clinton said, as he took his leave. "Just a word with you, Inspector." Armadale followed him from the room. "Now, Inspector, there's a lot for you to do yet. First of all, get these fingerprints. Then telephone to London and get Keswick's business address. As soon as you get it, let me know. But you got his address from the correspondence, sir, surely? It's in Fifth Avenue. I want his other address, his office in New York, you understand. His office will be shut by now, if you're going to cable," the inspector pointed out, thoughtlessly. "No, it won't. You forget that their time is some hours behind ours. We'll catch him in office hours if you hurry. Then when you've done that, get Foss's face photographed, and arrange for a constable and reliefs to be posted at the museum door till further orders. The museum door is to be left open and the light is to be left burning at night, so that he can keep his eye on things. Inspector Armadale jotted some notes in his pocketbook. As he closed this, he seemed to think of something. There's just one thing, sir. You want to get into the safe? Couldn't we get the number of the lock combination from the makers? They must know it. Sir Clinton shook his head. Unfortunately, the safe has no maker's nameplate on it, Inspector. I looked at the time we examined it. It's a fairly old pattern, though, I noticed, and if it hasn't got a balanced fence arbor, I think I can guarantee to find the combination of it with a little assistance. Armadale looked rather blank. I thought these things were too stiff to tackle, he said. Sir Clinton suppressed a smile. You ought to read Edgar Allan Poe, Inspector. Human ingenuity cannot concoct a cipher which human ingenuity cannot resolve, was a dictum of his. If I'm not mistaken about that safe, I think I could guarantee to open it in less than 10 minutes. The resources of science, and all that, you know. But I think it would be better to wait a while and see if Mr. Chasewater turns up to open it for us himself. But perhaps Mr. Chasewater's body is inside it now, the inspector suggested. There may have been a double murder, for all we know. In that case, we shall find him when we open it, Sir Clinton assured him lightly. If he's inside, he'll hardly be likely to shift his quarters. Chapter 10. The Shot in the Clearing. When Sir Clinton reached his office on the morning after the murder at Ravensthorpe, he found Inspector Armadale awaiting him with a number of exhibits. I've brought everything that seemed worthwhile, Armadale explained. I thought you might care to look at some of the things again, although you've seen them already. That's very good of you, Inspector. I should like to see some of them, as a matter of fact. Now suppose we begin with the fingerprints. They might suggest a few fresh ideas. They seem to suggest more notions than I have room for in my head, the inspector confessed ruefully. It's a most tangled case, to my mind. Then let's start with the fingerprints, the chief constable proposed. At least they'll settle some points, I hope. Armadale unwrapped a large brown paper parcel. I got the lot without any difficulty, and last night we photographed them all and enlarged the pictures. They're all here. You took Foss's, I suppose. Yes, and I managed to find some of Maurice Chasewater's too. That's pretty sharp work, Sir Clinton complimented his subordinate. How did you manage to make sure they were his? I asked for his set of razors, sir, and took them from the blades. He'd left prints here and there of his finger and thumb, either on the blade or on the handle. Of course I couldn't get anything else very sharp, but there are quite enough for the purpose, as you'll see. He laid out 3 enlarged photographs on the desk before Sir Clinton. Then, below each of the first 2, he put down a second print. This first print, he said, pointing to it, represents the fingerprints we found on the automatic pistol. You can see that it's the arch pattern on the thumb. Now here, he indicated the companion print, is Foss's thumbprint, and if you look at it, you'll see almost at a glance that it's identical with the print on the pistol. They're identical. I've measured them. And there are no other prints except Foss's on the pistol. Good, said Sir Clinton. And that, said John, is that. We know where we are so far as the pistol's concerned. Pass along, please. I've examined the pistol, the inspector continued. It's fully loaded in the magazine and has an extra cartridge in the barrel, but it hasn't been fired recently so far as I can see. Now for the next pair of prints, Sir Clinton suggested. This represents the thumbprint from the sword, or whatever you call it, said the inspector. Also prints of the 2 middle fingers of the right hand, found on the weapon. The second print of the pair shows identical fingerprints from a different source. The thumbprints in the 2 cases are not exactly alike, because you get only the edge of the thumb marked in the grip of a sword, whereas the other specimen gives a full imprint. But I think you'll find they're the same. I've measured them, too. You can see that the thumb pattern is a loop type, quite different from Foss's prints, and there's a trace of a tiny scar at the edge of the thumb in both these prints. I'd like you to compare them carefully, sir. Sir Clinton took up the 2 prints and scanned them with care, comparing the images point by point. There's no mistake possible, he said. The 2 sets are identical, so far as I can see, and the scar on the thumb is a clinching bit of evidence. You admit they're from the same hand, asked the inspector, with a peculiar look at Sir Clinton. Undoubtedly. Now whose are the second set? The inspector continued to look at his superior with something out of the common in his expression. The second set of prints came from Maurice Chasewater's razors, he said. The chief constable's lips set tightly and a touch of grimness showed in his face. I see we shall have to be quite clear about this, Inspector, he said, bluntly. By the look of you, you seem to think I'd be taken aback by this evidence, because Mr. Chasewater is a friend of mine. I was taken aback, naturally enough. But if you think it's going to make any difference to the conduct of this case, and I seem to see something of the sort in your face, you can put that out of your mind once for all. The business of the police is to get hold of the murderer, whoever he may be. Friendship doesn't come into these affairs, Inspector. So kindly don't suspect me of anything of that kind in future. You know what I mean. I needn't put it into words. Without giving Armadale time for reply, he picked up the last print. What's this? It's the set of prints I took from the valet's fingers, the inspector hastened to explain. It corresponds to nothing I've found anywhere else. You can see it's a whorl type on the thumb. Sir Clinton examined the print for a moment or two, then put it down. What about the box and the wristwatch? He asked. Inspector Armadale's face showed that here he was puzzled. There's nothing on either of them, not a recent mark of any description. And yet the man who packed them up must have fingered both things. With gloves on, evidently. But why gloves? The inspector demanded. Why gloves? Sir Clinton echoed, rather sarcastically. To avoid leaving fingerprints, of course. That's obvious. But why avoid leaving fingerprints on a thing that you're sending to a jeweler for repair? Think it over, Inspector. I won't insult you by telling you my solution. Let's take another point. Have you the watch itself here? The inspector produced it and handed it over. Sir Clinton took out a pocket knife and opened the back of the case. No use, he announced, after examining the back cover carefully. It's never been repaired. There are no reference marks scratched on the inside of the back as there usually are when a watch has gone back to the watchmakers. If there had been, we might have found out something about Foss in that way, by getting hold of the watchmakers. By the way, have you timed this thing as I asked you to do? It's running on time, Armadale answered. It hasn't varied a rap in the last 12 hours. A practically new watch, running to time, never needed repair so far, dispatched by post with no finger marks of the dispatcher. Surely you can see what that means. Inspector Armadale shook his head. It might be a secret message, he hazarded, though without much confidence. I mean a prearranged code. So it might, Sir Clinton agreed. The only thing against that in my mind is that I'm perfectly sure that it wasn't. Armadale looked sulky. I'm hardly clever enough to follow you, sir, I'm afraid. Sir Clinton's expression grew momentarily stern, but the shade passed from his face almost instantly. This is one of these cases, Inspector, where I think that two heads are better than one. Now if I tell you what's in my mind, it might tempt you to look at things exactly as I do, and then would have lost the advantage of having two brains at work on the business independently. We're more likely to be usefully employed if we pool the facts and keep our interpretations separate from each other. The tone of the chief constable's voice went a good way towards soothing the inspector's ruffled feelings, the more so since he saw the weight of Sir Clinton's reasoning. I'm sorry, sir. I quite see your point now. Sir Clinton had the knack of leaving no ill feelings in his subordinates. By an almost imperceptible change of manner, he dismissed the whole matter and restored cordiality again. Let's get back to the pure facts, Inspector. Each of us must look at them in his own way, but we can at least examine some of them without biasing each other. Did you get any more information out of that chauffeur? Inspector Armadale seemed glad enough to forget the slight friction between himself and his chief, as the tone of his voice showed when he replied. I could get nothing out of him at all, sir. He seems a stupid sort of fellow. But it was quite clear that somehow or other he'd picked up the idea that Foss meant to leave Ravensthorpe for good yesterday afternoon. He stuck to that definitely, and the packing up of his traps shows that he believed it. We can take it, then, that Foss gave reason for the man thinking that he was going away. Put your own interpretation on that, Inspector, but you needn't tell me what you make of it. The inspector's smile showed that ill feeling had gone. Very well, Sir Clinton. And I'll admit that I had my suspicions of the valet. He seems to have a clear bill now in the matter of the fingerprints on the weapon. Perhaps I was a bit rough on the man, but he annoyed me, a cheeky fellow. Oh, don't let's use hard words about him, Sir Clinton suggested chaffingly. Let's call him cool, simply. Well, his fingerprints weren't on the handle of the sword, anyhow, the inspector admitted. I hardly expected them to be, was all the comment Sir Clinton saw fit to make. Now what about friend Foss? By the way, I don't mind saying that I still think these two affairs at Ravensthorpe are interconnected. And one thing's clear at any rate, Foss wasn't the man in white. You remember he was wearing a cowboy costume according to the valet's evidence, and we found that costume in his wardrobe, which confirms Marden. The inspector seemed to be taking a leaf out of Sir Clinton's book. He refrained from either acquiescing in or contradicting the chief constable's statement that the two cases were linked. Foss had more ready money in his pocket than most people carry. He was in a position to clear out of Ravensthorpe at any moment without needing to go back to his flat or even to a bank. I think these facts are plain enough, he pointed out. And they fit in with the chauffeur's evidence, such as it is. And he had no latchkey of his flat with him, Sir Clinton supplemented. Of course it was a service flat and he may have left the key behind him instead of carrying it with him. One could find that out if it were worthwhile. There's a good deal that needs explaining about Foss, the inspector observed. I've got his photograph here, taken from the body yesterday. He produced it as he spoke. Send a copy to Scotland Yard, Inspector, please, and ask if they have any information about him. Considering everything, it's quite likely we might learn something. You might send his fingerprints also, to see if they have them indexed there. I'll send Marden's too, when I'm at it, the inspector volunteered, and the chauffeur's. We might as well be complete when we're at it. Sir Clinton indicated his agreement without saying anything. He changed the subject when he next spoke. We've agreed to pool the facts, Inspector, and I've got a contribution, 2 contributions in fact, towards the common stock. Here's the first. He laid a telegraph form on the desk before Armadale, and the inspector read the wording. Have no agent named Foss. Am not negotiating for Leonardo medallions. Keswick. Well, that's a bit of a surprise, ejaculated the inspector. It was obvious that there was something fishy, but I hadn't imagined it was as fishy as all that. Keswick knows nothing about him, then. My cable was fairly explicit. It's clear that friend Foss had no authority from Keswick. But what about all that correspondence between Maurice Chasewater and Keswick that we saw? Forgeries, so far as the Keswick letters were concerned, obviously. One of Keswick's household must have been in league with Foss and intercepted Maurice Chasewater's letters. Then replies were forged and dispatched. I've cabled Keswick about it this morning, so as to get the news in at once. The Confederate may hear of Foss's murder through the newspapers in 4 or 5 days when our papers get across there. He might bolt when he got the news. I've given Keswick a chance to forestall that if he wants to. That puts a new light on things, certainly, Armadale said when he had considered the new facts. Foss was a wrong UN masquerading here for some purpose or other. The medallions, probably. That fits in with all the unmarked linen and the rest of it. But why was he murdered? Sir Clinton disregarded the question. I've got another fact to contribute, he went on. You remember that Marconi otophone in Foss's room? I've made some inquiries about it. It's a thing they make for the use of deaf people, a modern substitute for the ear trumpet. The inspector made a gesture of bewilderment. But Foss wasn't deaf. He admitted to you that he had good enough hearing, when he was telling you about overhearing Foxton Polegate in the Winter Garden. That's quite true, Sir Clinton rejoined. But he evidently needed an otophone for all that. The inspector pondered for a few moments before speaking. It beats me, he said at last. Sir Clinton dismissed the subject without further discussion. Now what about Maurice Chasewater? He inquired. There's no great difficulty in suggesting how he disappeared from the museum. It's common talk hereabout that Ravensthorpe has secret passages, and one of them may end up in the wall of the museum. It was the turn of Armadale to contribute a fresh fact. He didn't appear at any local station yesterday or this morning, and he didn't use a motor of any sort that I've been able to trace. I've had men on that job and it's been thoroughly done. Congratulations, Inspector. If he hasn't got away, then he must be somewhere in the neighborhood still. I should say that was indisputable, if not certain, commented Sir Clinton, with a return of his faintly chaffing manner. A man can only be in one place at once, if you follow me. And if he's not there, then he must be here. Yes. But where is here, in this particular case, inquired Armadale, following his chief's mood. I expect he's hiding somewhere around. It's what anyone might do if they found themselves up to the hilt in a case of murder, he paused for an instant, or manslaughter, and got into a panic over it. Sir Clinton ignored the inspector's last sentence. I wish I could get into touch with Cecil Chasewater. He ought to be at home just now. He's the only man in the family now, and he ought to take charge of things up there. You haven't got his address yet, sir? Not yet. Sir Clinton put the subject aside. Now, Inspector, let me remind you of what's wanted. What was the crime? Who did it? When was it done? And where? How done? And with what motive? Who in the deed did share? You put it down as murder. Or manslaughter, corrected Armadale. And we know when, how, and where, at any rate. Do we? Sir Clinton rejoined. Speak for yourself. I'm not so sure about when and where yet, and how is still a dark mystery so far as I'm concerned. I mean, he added, so far as legal proof goes. The inspector was about to say something further when a knock at the door was heard and a constable appeared in answer to Sir Clinton's summons. The Ravensthorpe headkeeper wants to see you, Sir Clinton, if you can spare him a moment. He says it's important. The chief constable ordered the keeper to be admitted. Well, Mould, what's your trouble? He inquired, when the man appeared. It's this way, Sir Clinton, Mould began. Seeing the queer sort o' things we've seen lately, it seemed to me that maybe another queer thing that's happened might be important. So I thought it over, and I made bold to come and tell you about it. He seemed to lose confidence a little at this point, but Sir Clinton encouraged him by a show of interest. Last night, he went on, I was going through the wood at the back o' the house, about 11 o'clock it was, as near as I can make it. At the back o' the house there's a strip of woodland, then a little bit of a clearing, and then the rest of the wood. I'd come out o' the bigger bit o' the wood and got most o' the way across the clearing when it happened. I can tell you just where it was, for I was passin' the old ruin there, the Knight's Tower they call it. He paused for a moment or two, evidently finding continuous narrative rather strain. The moon was well up by that time. It's just past the full these days, and the place was as clear as day. Everything was quiet, except an old owl that lives in a hollow tree up by there. I could hear the swish of my feet in the grass and mighty little else, for the grass was dewy and made a lot o' noise with my stepping through it. Well, as I was going along, all of a sudden I heard a shot. It sounded close by me, and I turned at once. There's a poachin' chap that's given me a lot o' trouble, and I didn't put it past him to think he might be trying to give me a scare. But when I turned round there was nothing to be seen. There was nothing there at all, and yet that shot had come from quite close by. Did it sound like the report of a shotgun? Sir Clinton asked. Mould seemed to be in a difficulty. Shotgun sounds I know fairly well. T weren't from a shotgun. More like a pistol shot it sounded, when I'd had time to think over it. And yet it weren't altogether like a pistol shot, neither. That's a sharp sound. This was more booming-like, if you understand me. I'm afraid I don't quite see it yet, Mould, Sir Clinton admitted. I know how difficult it is to describe sounds, though. Have another try. Did it remind you of anything? A light seemed to flicker for a moment in Mould's memory. I know, he exclaimed. It was like this. I've got it. Did you ever stand at the door of our Morris Tube range in the village while there was firing going on inside? Well, this was something like that, only more so. I mean as if they'd fired something a bit heavier than a miniature rifle. That's it. That's just how it sounded. He was evidently relieved by having found what he considered an apt simile. What happened after that? Sir Clinton demanded. When I saw nobody near me, I'll admit I felt a bit funny. Here was a shot coming, so it seemed, out o' the empty air, with nothing to account for it. Straight away, I'll admit, sir, I began thinking of that black man that little Jenny Hitchin has been spreading the story about lately. Sir Clinton pricked up his ears. We'll hear about the black man later on, Mould, if you please. Tell us what you did at that moment. Well, sir, I searched about. The moon was clear of clouds and the place was just an open glade. The shot had come from quite nearby, as I said. But when I hunted I could find nothing. There wasn't a track in the dew on the grass. My own tracks showed up in the moonlight as clear as clear. There wasn't anyone hiding in the old ruin. I went through and around it twice. There wasn't a sound, for the shot had frightened the owl. I found nothing. And yet I take my oath that shot was fired not more than 10 or a dozen yards away from me. Did you hear any whistle of shot or a bullet? No, sir. That's the whole story? Now, tell us about this black man you mentioned. Mould seemed rather shamed. Oh, that's just child's chatter, Sir Clinton. I oughtn't to have mentioned it. I'm quite willing to listen to child's chatter, Mould, if it happens to be unusual. Mould evidently decided to take the plunge, though obviously he regretted having mentioned the matter at all. This Jenny Hitchins, a child that lives with her grandmother on the estate. The girl's there at night in case anything goes wrong with the old woman. Old Mrs. Hitchin was taken ill one night lately, about the middle of the night. Pretty bad she seemed, and Jenny had to dress and go off for the doctor in a hurry. That took her through the woods. It's a shortcut that way and the moonlight was bright. And as she was going along. What night was this? Sir Clinton interrupted. The keeper thought for a moment or two. Now I come to think of it, he said, T was the night of that robbery up at Ravensthorpe. So it was. And as Jenny was going along through the woods she saw, so she says, a black man slip-pin about from tree to tree. A man in dark clothes. No, sir. If I understood rightly, T was a black man. I mean a naked man with a black skin, black all over. Did he molest the child? No, sir. He seemed to be trying to keep out of her road if anything. But oh course it gave her a start. She took and ran, and small blame to her, I think. She's only 11 or so, and it gave her a dreadful fright. And of course next day this tale was all over the countryside. I wonder if you didn't hear it yourself, sir. It's news to me, Mould, I'm afraid. Even the police can't know everything, you see. Now before you go I want something more from you. That night when you were on guard in the museum, you remember. Do you recall seeing anyone there at any time during the evening dressed in cowboy clothes? You know, the kind of thing in the Wild West films. Mould pondered for a time, evidently racking his memory. No, sir. I remember nobody like that. I think I'd have recalled it if I had. I'm rather keen on films about cowboys myself, and if I'd seen a cowboy I'd have had a good look at him, just out of curiosity. Sir Clinton had apparently got all he needed from Mould just then, and he sent him away quite reassured that his visit had not been wasted. What do you make of all that, Inspector? He inquired with a faintly quizzical expression on his face, as soon as the door had closed behind the keeper. Armadale shook his head. Then, seeing a chance of scoring, he smiled openly. I was to keep my ideas to myself, you remember, Sir Clinton. The chief constable gave him smile for smile. That arrangement must be especially useful when you've no ideas at all, Inspector. Armadale took the thrust with good humor. Give me time to think, Sir Clinton. You know I've only a slow mind, and perhaps this isn't one of my bright days. Before Sir Clinton could retort the desk telephone rang and the chief constable lifted the receiver. Yes, I am. Thanks very much. I'll take down the address if you'll read it to me. He jotted something down on a sheet of paper. Thanks. Goodbye, Joan. He flicked the note over to Armadale. Would you mind seeing if we can get on to that house by phone, Inspector? Hunt up the London directory for it. It's Cecil Chasewater's address, said Armadale, glancing at the slip. Yes. The man he's staying with may be on the phone. In a few minutes the inspector came back with a number and Sir Clinton rang up. After a short talk he put down the receiver and turned to Armadale. He says he can't come today. You heard me explaining that we want that secret passage opened, if there is one. But he doesn't seem to think there's any hurry. He has some business which will keep him till tomorrow. I heard you tell him that his brother's disappeared, the inspector commented. I'd have thought that would have brought him back quick enough. It hasn't, evidently, was all that Sir Clinton thought it necessary to say. There seemed to be no reason for admitting the inspector into the secret of the Ravensthorpe quarrels.